morning. It looks like it's on, yeah. I think you have to be close to it, I think. Recognizing a quorum, I am calling this meeting of the Cannabis Control Commission to order at 10:05 a.m. on Wednesday, February 28th. Can everybody hear me in the back room, in the back rows? Thank you. Is anybody recording this meeting? Let me put the public on notice, therefore, that this meeting is being recorded. Thank you. Can I also ask people to put their cell phones on silent or to shut them off altogether? Thank you. Welcome to day 3. And those of you that were here when we had our 4 days of policy meetings in December will recall an incredibly eloquent speech by Commissioner McBride talking about how ineloquent she was going to be that day because she was so tired. I thought it was kind of a contradiction that she was so eloquent talking about her ineloquence. I wish I was that eloquent, but I do want to apologize ahead of time if we've covered a lot, and so I want to apologize if I'm not my articulate self this morning. We are going to, I think, be able to finish up everything that is left today. We made a ton of progress over the last 2 days, but there's still quite a bit more, so I'm going to be open about timing for breaks and whether we'll take a lunch break or not. I think if it looks like we're going to be able to finish by 12 or 1, we obviously won't take a lunch break, but if it looks like it's going to take longer, we'll find time to take a lunch break sometime in the noon to 12:30 time frame. For my fellow commissioners, the slides we're going to use today are the same slides that Mary Alice distributed yesterday. The only difference is that I've shaded the topics that we've already covered and left unshaded the ones that we need to cover today. So hopefully everybody will be able to follow along. Before we get into the remaining topics, so I think that there's one topic that, and I apologize for this, but there's one topic that I think we need to reopen just to make sure that there's clarity and alignment among the commission about what we agreed to. There's actually several subtopics, but I wanted to just have a short conversation, hopefully, about cultivation, and specifically the topic that I wanted to make sure that we were clear on and aligned on was the topic of the 100,000 square foot limit that we described yesterday, and whether that applies per license or per licensee. I hope it's not unfair to ask Commissioner Doyle to raise that issue again, or describe the issue again, since you were leading yesterday. And then I think we can talk about whether we need to have further conversation about this.
Okay, sure. So in looking around the country and hearing headlines, or sorry, not hearing headlines, reading headlines regarding overproduction in other states, I was persuaded that it made sense to propose cultivation caps. And around the country, it seems where there are cultivation caps, it seems to be the average that it's 30,000 per license, which I thought didn't really fit our state because I think there are registered marijuana dispensaries that may already be bigger than that or have plans to grow bigger than that. So I thought rather than put the 30,000 cap on a particular license, that I would propose a 100,000 square foot license, cap for licensee rather than license. That way, since the existing RMD applicants only were allowed one cultivation facility, I don't believe any of them are 100,000 square feet, so that would leave them room for some controlled growth and not make it so that they would grow so enormous that they would occupy the field and block the ability of smaller, newer players to get in. And then I had also proposed, since a craft marijuana cooperative has the equivalent of one license but multiple locations, that they have a 30,000 square foot. I think in cap in the course of the conversation yesterday, that those amounts changed, or there was discussion of changing the amounts. I'm going to stick to my initial recommendations. I wasn't clear on whether or not we had taken a vote. I apologize, it's tired commissioner syndrome again. So I just
I'm sorry, Executive Director.
I don't think you did take a vote.
Okay.
Okay.
You did not. sorry. More is better.
And so the other thing that I realized in looking at the fact that we were discussing this kind of cap is that we may also want to look at whether or not the tiers as they are now make sense in relation to that.
Can I request that we separate those two
Sure,
issues?
absolutely,
So let's
absolutely.
focus on the caps per license and licensee, and then we'll come back to the tiering question.
Okay.
Are there other comments? I think that I pushed back a little bit on Commissioner Doyle when we spoke this morning about the 30,000 limit for craft cultivators, and suggested that
I think Commissioner Title did yesterday as well.
So I think we need to just be clear on what we're voting on and have a vote on this, and so I think right now the proposal on the table is that there is a 100,000 square foot limit per licensee, and a 100,000 square foot limit on craft cultivators, who essentially are one licensee. So that's the proposal on the table. Before we vote, I'd like to get other comments and thoughts, and then let's officially vote on it. Commissioner Title?
I'm sorry to ask the same question several times, but
No,
100,000.
I think Kay has given us all the the tired commissioner syndrome.
Commissioner Doyle.
Commissioner Doyle, sorry.
100,000 square feet per licensee for the total of 3 licenses?
Yes, and so that's where it would be consistent with what other states are doing, because they're capping it at 30,000, but that just didn't quite fit well with us because it would constrain people who may have already built out beyond that or be significantly down the road in planning out for that. So I didn't want to unduly constrain businesses that are already underway, but I did think that we should probably learn from what other states are doing, because some of them at least are much further down the road than we are on this. And then if we learn, because obviously we're doing this all quite quickly, if we learn that 30,000 per license is too constrained, or sorry, it works out to be 30,000
The
per
average,
license,
yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah.
But can we just be, so the language is 100,000 per licensee.
Exactly. So if that, we get information that's evidence-based that says, oh, that's not going to work, it's going to unduly constrain business, etc., we know we're reopening the regulations in approximately however many months' time, it's within the next year, we can, take that time to adjust, figure out whether or not we need to adjust that number or not. But I do want to try and at least err on the side of the cautious end of things, and then adjust upwards rather than the other way around, just because I think that's more business friendly.
That seems low to me. However, my main concern is just that there's no one operating at a bigger level now. And based on the information that I have, there isn't. So I think I would support that if the rest of the commission did. However, I do feel strongly that the co-op limit should be the same.
Yeah, I think that's what I just proposed that we discuss and vote on if we're comfortable, but I agree with that, Commissioner Title.
Related to that, could I ask a question of the chairman?
I
think you know what question I'm gonna
I
ask.
prefer you didn't, but go ahead.
Yeah. So the downside, and as everybody knows, very pro-farmer, the downside to the 100,000 cap for farmers. Now, obviously, some of this is perhaps going to depend on where they want to get in terms of licensing fees and what they can afford to license themselves for. But it also gives them room, if we, based on our other vote yesterday, that we didn't cap locations, we just capped square footage.
Correct.
It gives room for a lot more locations, and I don't know if that affects your fee calculation.
Well, we're going to come to fees in a few seconds.
Yeah,
And
so
what I'm going to propose for discussion and vote is that we essentially charge license fees to craft cooperatives that are comparable to what we're charging for other cultivators in terms of, based upon the square footage, with one change, which is that for any location above 6 locations, that we charge the lowest tier of licensing fee for each of those locations to cover the cost of additional inspection and enforcement.
Okay, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how big the location is. It's just the.
Yeah, it's just a number of locations because they're going to be covered. But they're going to be covered essentially by the if the fees, which I'm proposing, are going to be the same for craft cultivators as they are for non-craft cultivators based upon square footage. I think we've already taken that into account, and all I'm doing is trying to reflect the incremental cost of additional locations that would have to be inspected. So we're going to get to that shortly, but and you don't necessarily have to take my proposal, but I think my proposal reflects your concern, or tries to address your concern.
I'm absorbing, sorry.
Yeah,
Did
that's
you
okay. Commissioners Title or McBride or Flanagan?
I continue to be aligned with Commissioner Doyle and her recommendation.
On the 30,000 rather than
this.
100,000
Yeah,
for co-ops.
So, however, Mr. Chairman, could you, just because I work a little bit better with sort of like a, given like a context.
Sure.
Can you spell out a context like what you just explained, where we would have, with the craft cooperative, just so I can kind of put some numbers to it.
Sure, let me, I don't want to get into all the fees right now, but let me get to that slide. And I apologize, I'm not sure how easily read this is, but we're going to, when we get to fees, the reason this is a little bit premature is that Commissioner Doyle has suggested that we reconsider the tiering and add additional tiers, and that's a separate conversation, but it won't change the basic economics. And so what I'm proposing here, and this is no different than what we saw yesterday for cultivation, the 4 tiers, different application and different annual licensing fees based upon which tier, and then for the biggest tier where there can be over 10,000 square feet up to, we didn't impose a limit at that time, an incremental 25 cents per square feet. So that hasn't changed. Yesterday we voted on reducing the fees, both application fees and licensing fees for outdoor cultivation by 50%. So that's what's reflected here. And then what I have added this morning is for craft marijuana cultivators or cooperatives, charge them an application fee that is consistent with tiering for regular cultivation based upon how much square footage they're asking to license, and charge them an annual license fee, again consistent with the tier that the co-op collectively is in, again allowing them to have a 50% reduction if their cultivation is outdoors rather than indoors. So no change and absolutely the same, but in the small print there, what you can see is that I propose that we charge an additional fee, which is the tier 1 annual license fee of $1,000 for indoor, $500 for outdoor. Charge that additional incremental fee for each member of the cooperative above 6 to cover, as I said, our incremental inspection and enforcement costs. Does that help you, Commissioner McBride?
It does. So, Commissioner Tatel, you asked the question about the square footage for cooperatives, and so what's your judgment on what the square footage, like what's a fair square footage there?
For the co-ops or for, well, I think that it should be the same as for cultivation. I don't think there's any reason for there to be a difference, and that we're trying to encourage co-ops.
And for what it's worth, I support that position.
Are we discussing that substantively?
No, we're going back to where we were, which is talking about.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out, and I'm not, my math brain is not functioning, but I'm trying to figure out, so if the idea is that we adopted the 7 principles, right, the co-op principles yesterday, in order
yes.
to, right, and the idea there is that it's basically one vote per farmer, right, in a co-op, and it's a democratic system. We lifted the cap of 6 that we put on because we want to be able to encourage that type of entity.
Right.
And so and maybe I'm just again, like my math brain might not be working. Is this amount of saying $1,000 for each member above 6 actually? Is it sort of like a prohibition on the formation of like a really vibrant co-op? I guess I'm kind of figure out what the.
I guess my intent, and I'm more than open to feedback and suggestions. My intent was to allow for and to a certain extent incent co-ops to add members.
Right.
Because I think that's important. But I also thought that it was important to just reflect reality, which is that as they add more members,
You have more
our
obligation.
enforcement costs go
Yeah.
up. And so I was trying, the whole, this goes back to our December conversation, which is that in the language of the statute, our fees are supposed to cover our costs. And so what I was trying to do is estimate
Right.
what the incremental cost would be
Okay.
as they added the members above 6. I think that's one of the things that, back to Commissioner Doyle's comment, we're going to learn. I mean, we've estimated what our enforcement and inspection fees are going to be. I think as we see what they actually are, we might have to make some adjustments going forward, but that's the best estimate that we have right now.
Can I ask you a question on that? Why are we incentivizing them to have more members? I don't understand that part.
I don't think it's incentivizing them to have more members as much as not limiting it. Because the
I'm sorry,
concern that
that-
we heard about 6 locations is that if
Oh,
someone wants to
okay.
grow a co-op,
So it's-
they may feel like they're blocked out from other people who have more resources.
I think that's better language,
Okay.
let me take back the incent and just say allow.
Okay, that makes more sense. I just had a moment of,
Yeah, no, I think that's their decision.
Mhm.
And frankly, I just think we want to allow for them to organize and to scale up in a way that makes sense. And I personally, for whatever, I personally don't have any problems with big co-ops in terms of lots of members and to support Commissioner Tom's position in terms of not having a lower cap. I think it's a good thing, frankly, if they grow and add members and produce as much as they are capable of selling within our 85% constraint.
Yeah, my only concern is I almost feel like that takes it and makes it unequal between the two different players.
What's
Because
that?
I think everybody else will have this limit of 100,000 potentially divided by 3, and the craft has 100,000 divided by basically 1. So that's that.
But there are going to be multiple members. I mean, I think that one way to think about it is that it's going to be 100,000 divided by 6 or more. Because there are going to be at least 6 members in each, well, not at least 6, but there'll be multiple members in each co-op. And so essentially for each of those members, they're going to be constrained by 100,000 divided by the number of members.
Yeah. I don't, I will say I am concerned that it won't get to the underlying purpose of why we're trying to do this, which is to prevent overproduction. But it may be something that merits further study. The worry that I have is that if we authorize 100,000 now for the craft marijuana cooperative, the genie is out of the bottle and difficult to put back.
I've heard that line before somewhere.
Yeah, so, and I don't think it's a misplaced one. I mean, there's real concern for me that, we say one thing and then constrict, because Oregon had to do that. They had a higher amount. They authorized 30,000 times 3, which is actually what I'm saying, so, and they had to pull back so that only 30,000 was authorized.
So I'd like to comment on that if I could.
Sure.
First of all, I agree with your concern.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a question of how do we effectually deal with that concern. I'll say a couple of things. One is I have that concern in terms of total cultivation, not just craft versus other cultivation. I have that concern with total cultivation. We have talked about and agreed upon a system that we believe will help us manage that issue. So that being said, if we believe that system will manage that issue in terms of overproduction, I can't see any logic, at least in my own mind, for putting the craft cooperatives in a situation where they can't grow to the same extent that a privately owned cultivator could grow. I think that either we're convinced that we have safeguards in place to prevent overproduction in general, or we don't. But I don't think that, in my mind, changes the issue about craft cooperatives. If we were really concerned that we have overproduction risks that we have not addressed through our draft regulations, then I think we need to talk about all of the caps, not just on craft cultivation. I'd rather not kind of make them the place that we focus on reducing the overproduction possibility. I'd rather do that across the board. So to me, they're separate issues, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I agree very much with the concern about overproduction, which we tried to address in our regulations in our conversation yesterday.
So maybe as a way to compromise on this management, this growth management issue, yesterday we had talked about setting a place for people to come in, you know? And I had made the recommendation that it be, what we're now calling tier 3, which I think is the 5,000
5 to 10.
Yeah, they can pick, you know, any of the tiers under that or any amount under that, and then that's when the production controls kick in. And what I think the discussion had led to yesterday was not doing that because people wanted to, I think people were more in favor of letting the licensee pick where they came in. But the worry that I have is that that basically makes production or growth management controls meaningless, because why wouldn't you just come in at the top? Then you don't have to demonstrate anything. You have to pay for it, obviously,
That's at least one issue, but go ahead, Commissioner Tuttle.
So, so first, just to quickly address the point about 100,000 among 3 licenses and the whole genie bottle thing. We're being very conservative there. I mean, an average of 33,000 per license is objectively low. I think if you look at the national averages.
That is the national average, though, I think.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
the cap. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so just putting that out there. My concern is fairness, and so I don't have a strong feeling on what the cap should be. But if we institute a cap, we need to be fair to the co-ops and have the same cap for cultivation and the total co-op. And we also need to make sure that we're being fair to new entrants versus people who are already operating. And so I absolutely would not support a system where new entrants are coming in at one tier and need to prove before they can move up, versus others that are already operating coming in at a certain tier. But I'm flexible on the amount.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioners Tuttle, McBride, and Flanagan?
No.
Okay. No, you don't agree?
I'm not, no, I'm not gonna, I have nothing to add.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just said there's.
Take your time, take your time.
I'm thinking my forecasted when we're gonna get done might.
I thought it was
change.
ambitious, I will say.
Go ahead.
And so if, one thing that I'm thinking with regard to the setting a place for everybody to start and go from, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. With people that are already up and running, it doesn't look like we have data to draw on that's readily accessible in terms of who is at what amount. But if, and I think it's probably relatively likely, if there are RMDs up and running that are already over, say, 30,000, are you saying we should start them at whatever they're at now, but then other people would start at a different, or the opposite of that?
I'm saying we should stick with the relegation that we decided on. I love that word now, by the way. It has grown on me.
I have a very good friend who's British who has thanked me dearly for introducing that to the vernacular.
So that is what I support. I think we had a great discussion about it yesterday. I'm consistent on that. What I was suggesting now is that were we to make a change that people need to come in at a certain tier, then I think everybody, including current operators, would need to come in at the same tier. But
So
I'm not calling for that.
Yeah, no. I'm just trying to understand it, how it would work, like, functionally. So if they did that, they would be able to maintain their current, if they're going to stay medical as well as adult use. Are we separating out how much is devoted to, because the thing we agreed on yesterday was we weren't gonna separate virtual. Yeah, I'm sorry, we weren't
Virtual
gonna separate,
separation.
yeah, we weren't going to track separately adults and medical.
Right.
But then if we say, we know you're already larger, say you're 50,000, and we start everybody at a lower rate, I'm not sure what happens to those extra plants. So I'm trying, that's why
If I imagined that suggestion was on the table,
Yeah.
then I
Okay.
apologize. I do not support that suggestion. I
Okay.
support relegation, period.
Yeah, and I agree with Commissioner Tuttle.
Okay. So what I'm trying to figure out is when you're starting, you know, whenever you start and you're an existing RMD, are we saying they would start at whatever their existing canopy footprint is?
I actually think that everyone, including new entrants and existing RMDs, can pick the tier that they're in. If they don't meet the 85%,
I
then
think
they would go back down.
Two things. One is that, you know, they have to agree to pay the higher tier annual licensing fee. So that's their decision. And I agree with Commissioner Tuttle. I mean, that's the whole point of the relegation system, is to ensure that if whatever tier they choose to operate at, they are selling 85% of what they produce, or else they get relegated. So I guess I agree that people should be able to, if we're putting a cap on, which we are, and I think the question is, you know, what are the caps and whether they differ for different categories of licensees. Putting a cap on, that's the constraint, and people can choose where to operate under that cap, as long as they understand that they might get relegated to a lower tier.
So I'm worried that what that does is create somewhat of a loophole for the higher financed operations to shut out small business, because they won't be subject, they can afford to pay the, whatever it is, $25,000 fee, because they're going to pick 100,000, and they can afford the $25,000, whereas the smaller businesses are going to have to start smaller because that's the license fee that they can afford, and they're trying to afford all the various other things that goes along with starting up a business. So then the bigger guys are not going to be subject to production control, because they're paying for that 100,000 already. So then we're not looking at whether or not they're doing their 85% fee.
Until
85%
Until 6 months from
production.
now. I mean, we will look at that.
But they've already paid for the absolute top tier. So we may have to separate out the application fee from production control,
Yeah,
separate them all together.
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I mean, I think that I don't care if somebody pays the full fee if they're not producing, meeting the 85% threshold, then they get relegated. And whether we have to give it, if we do it sometime within the 12 months that the license fee applies, we might have to give them a rebate. But I think they're separate issues.
Okay, so they would still be paying, and I realize this may mess you up in terms of analyzing fee structure, and I apologize for that.
No, you don't.
Maybe not a little. But in that scenario, what I'm trying to understand is, if you still did fees by tiers, and someone pays $25,000,
Right.
and they pay for that absolute top tier, but they don't have that amount yet. They have like a smaller canopy in operation right now because they're converting from medical. We take them at the tier that they're at now and apply the production control regardless of what fee they've asked for.
I think that's correct.
Okay, that actually may close the loophole. I may have to let general counsel think about that a little.
Yeah, I think go ahead. Commissioner Tuttle?
I think we need to encourage businesses to make their own business decisions,
Oh, of
right? And if
course,
I have
yeah.
$25,000, and I am quite certain
You're
I'm
talking
going to make
hypothetically, right?
yeah, sure am. And I am quite certain that I'm going to make the 85%, right? Because I don't have $25,000 to just blow. Then I'm going to do that. If I have $25,000, I'm like, hey, maybe I'll make it. Maybe I'll be relegated. I don't care. That's fine with me either way.
Okay, so I would add to the recommendation, and I apologize to General Counsel and the Executive Director for making perhaps even more votes necessary, but I would recommend that we decouple the fees and production growth management to make sure that we don't accidentally create loopholes.
I think that's fine. I think the question would be, how frequently are we going to do the relegation analysis? And I think we talked about every 6 months.
We did.
And then the question becomes, if we do what you suggest, which I think is reasonable, we have to probably put in language that we rebate. If someone's prepaid the entire year and we relegate them to a lower tier, we probably have to refund okay.
Businesses
I would
need
like
to-
us to talk about that.
Okay.
Put it that way.
I would be against that.
Actually, I figured that out.
Just because there are certain, I would be, and this is more your area than mine, but I would be a little worried about budget uncertainty. But then also, you know, there are certain calculations you have to make as a business person, including, you know, non-refundable application fees. You know,
I'll back off, I think that's fine.
Okay.
I'll back off, I think that's fine. So there, you know, we'll do the relegation analysis on a 6-month basis. And that it is, that there will be no refund of a prepaid annual license fee if someone gets relegated to a lower tier. I'm fine with that.
Yeah. So,
I think that goes to Commissioner Child's principle.
okay.
So, about being thoughtful about, well, the theoretical $25,000.
So the one other point that I was gonna bring up in this area, unless I am diverting anyone who wants to speak on what we were immediately talking about, no, okay, is that, our tiers are quite small compared to another, oh,
Can we just-
sorry.
Yeah, can we just hold that? I'll get to it. I just want to close this issue, and then unless you
Yeah.
think that we're talking about tiering is required to close this issue, I'd rather separate the tiering conversation into, we'll get to it immediately
Okay.
as the next
sure.
topic. Is that
Yeah.
all right? Is that okay?
Yeah, do you wanna take a vote on this?
I want to
what
just
we said?
make sure that we're ready to take a vote, so I'm still anxious to hear from other commissioners that have weighed in thus far, if they feel like they would like to. I got you.
Still got nothing to say.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Not to, I guess, further confuse anybody, but do we want to discuss when we would actually begin this analysis, knowing that once we issue a license, there is a cultivation cycle
Right.
that occurs as far as the 6-month analysis, if 3 or 4 months are devoted to growing.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. My thought on that is that we do it annually, do it after 1 year, and then every 6 months thereafter. Does that make sense?
It does.
I guess I'd like to suggest that we vote on the following, if that's okay, which is that we have 100,000 square foot cap per licensee, and that we consider craft cooperatives as a licensee, and so therefore they are subject to the same cap. That we will talk about fees in a second, we'll talk about relegation, but that those rules will apply across both craft cultivators, co-ops, as well as non-cooperative growers. So I'd like to, we'll come, I think we can separate vote on the relegation issue and on the fee issue, so this is sort of just solely on the cap issue.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Of my fellow commissioners. Going from no limit to capping at approximately the national average is quite an extraordinary policy change. I'm wondering if anyone else has concerns about that. No? Okay.
Yeah, again, to me, it's about, are we confident in our relegation and production control regulations? So I'd like to propose again that we vote on a 100,000 square foot per licensee cap, and that, whether, and I'll defer to General Counsel, whether we need to explicitly state that a co-op is one licensee.
Just clarify it in the language.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to defer on that particular issue. So can I have a motion to approve that?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, let the record show that the commission unanimously approved that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, let the record show that Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Tile. I think we should stay on this topic and talk about relegation and other aspects that we need to of production control. I think the only thing that has changed or is worthy of conversation is the suggestion from the executive director that we analyze production versus the 85% threshold 1 year after the license is granted, and then every 6 months thereafter.
Well, if we didn't vote yesterday, then we also have to vote.
No, I think we voted on relegation, correct?
I don't have a vote on relegation.
How
So
did we
we
not,
should-
how did we not vote on
We did.
relegation? I'm pretty sure we did.
Pretty sure we did.
There's no
I don't
record
know
of
if we,
it.
did we vote on relegation or was it,
Mr. Executive Director, with respect to what was discussed and tabled?
There was a discussion of cultivation limits of 85% of the product sold. If a cultivator fails to demonstrate that 85% of the product was sold consistently over 6 months, the preceding 6 months, the tier would be reduced.
Okay.
And then you went into a
Okay.
discussion on that.
And so I think that should be on the table with the addition suggested by the executive director that that first analysis would be 12 months after the license is issued, and then subsequently every 6 months. Are there any questions or discussion on that, or should we put that to vote? Okay, can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Title made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that that motion is unanimously approved. Okay, we'll get to fees and tiers momentarily. I just think I want to go through in some kind of sequence just to make sure we haven't missed anything. Go ahead, Commissioner Doyle.
I don't think we've settled the issue of where people start that wasn't an explicit vote taken.
Okay.
So I don't think we can.
I think that the discussion ended up a few minutes ago that people can start wherever they want, with whatever fees they're willing to pay.
Mhm.
So if we need to vote on that, can I have a motion? Or do we want to discuss that further?
So I think we have to make part of that vote the fact that we are going to separate the fees from production, so that people who pick a particular production amount, if they, pick it, then they're going to, when we start testing this, they're going to have to be able to demonstrate that they've actually sold 85% or they get relegated. And again, I'm trying to make sure
Yeah,
that
no, I
the big
think this is
guys
great.
don't
This is great.
occupy the field such that the little guys get shut out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out kind of just how to articulate what I agree with what you're saying.
Okay.
Trying to articulate it. So I think that and this again, we're putting an incredible burden on our general counsel here. There's a lot of language that's very, very complicated here, but I think the concept is that we will allow new entrants to go into whatever tier they're willing to pay a license fee for. Point one. Point two is that we're going to give it, and we've already covered this, but just for inclusiveness, we're going to evaluate versus the 85% threshold after. Is there something?
No, go ahead.
We will evaluate the 85% threshold 1 year after the license is issued and subsequently every 6 months. And if we relegate to a lower tier because someone fails to meet that threshold, the annual license fee that has been prepaid will not be refundable, but obviously the next year when they re-up, it will be at the lower tier.
That's my thought, and the idea is so that people don't try to sort of avoid production management control just by paying that $25,000.
Right. So did I cover your suggestion in my language?
I think so, and obviously, we'll make everything subject to language and make sure next
Sure.
week that we've actually written it the way that we wanted it to be.
Okay.
So I will move that if it's time for motion, but if there's more discussion.
That sounds like Commissioner Tuttle.
I did have a question. I wanted to thank Commissioner Durrell for having the mental smartness to catch this and make sure we voted on it several times. To make sure we had a separate vote on it. And I just wanted to ask you, I'm sorry, to
Yeah, sure.
repeat it one more time, just to make sure.
All right, well, the odds of me getting it exactly the same or close to zero.
That's what I asked you to read it.
New entrants into the market, getting a new cultivation license, can get a license at any tier they so desire, presuming they pay the appropriate licensing fee. Point two is that we will analyze versus the 85% threshold after 12 months after the license is issued, and then subsequently every 6 months. If a cultivator fails to meet the 85% threshold and is relegated to a lower tier, the prepaid annual license fee is non-refundable, but subsequently when they renew their license, it will be at the lower fee based upon the tier they are relegated to. The tier to which they are relegated. That was for my second grade grammar teacher. Can I have a motion, please, to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Doyle made a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Title. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that that was unanimously approved. Thank you. Okay, so anything else, Commissioner Doyle? Before we'll come
go
to
back.
tiering and fees in a second, or not in a second, but shortly. Okay, so I'm going through all the previous slides. These slides have not changed since Monday. The only thing that's changed is that I've shaded the areas that we've already covered. So the one that is not shaded, excuse me, sir, with the cameras. I just can't read my own slides because your head is there. Thank you. There were environmental standards, and this was with respect to requiring data collection and submission regarding energy and water usage for cultivated or licensees in cultivation. We want to have a broader conversation about environmental issues, or?
Not, I mean, I presented what I could understand yesterday,
Okay.
and you had asked for further.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll come back to that one. With respect to RMD priority applicants, one issue that was not discussed is municipalities with retail bans. That is not a regulation or regulatory issue. It's something that we are addressing with conversations with the appropriate agencies, so I don't believe that's necessary for us to discuss unless there are other.
So
Commissioner McBride?
there was an issue that was brought to my attention last night relative to what we voted on the provisional versus final.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it may be something that is worth revisiting. So I would it be possible, I want to just pull,
Yeah, please.
So,
No.
so if you want to maybe move on, we can kind
No,
of.
I'd like to go through this sequence
Okay.
because we've been pushing stuff off, and then let's just
All right.
we'll knock them down in order.
So, yesterday, there was a section that was read, I think it was section 55 or section 56, that made a reference to provisional and final licenses, right?
Yep.
And there's a question about final not dispensing, and then provisional, which by virtue of what it is, isn't dispensing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have
Excuse me.
this mandate in the statute to provide priority licensing, and the question that was brought up is really about how finely tuned we are going to be treating that priority applicant phase. In other words, if the idea is going to be in that April 1 to 16 period, that is per the statute, if we're going to be letting in provisional and final license RMD, or if it's going to be some other version of that. So I went back through the statute last night, and this is one issue where I really, you can read this a lot of different ways, and so that's why I'm reopening this and asking that we give it some consideration
absolutely.
and think about what we want to do here. There's a section later on in the statute, section 73, which states in part that notwithstanding any general or special law to the contrary, for the purposes of reviewing and approving an application for a license to operate a marijuana establishment, the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission shall identify applicants who are holders of a provisional or final certificate of registration pursuant to Chapter 369 of the Acts of 2012, that's medical marijuana, and accompanying regulations. The Commission shall consider issuance of a provisional or final certificate of registration as achievement of accreditation status. The Commission shall ensure an expedited review process for applicants for a license to operate a marijuana establishment who have achieved accreditation status, and shall only require that such applicants submit specific information not previously required, analyzed, approved, and recognized by the Department of Public Health.
Right.
Now, hearkening back to December, when we drafted the regulations about the priority applicants and the application process, the accreditation piece, that is where I, in drafting that, pulled this from. So that in December was what we voted on, that we would have it be both final and provisional. There were some comments that were received during the public comment period about that maybe being too broad of a
Yes,
category.
right.
And that if the idea of the statute, and I think we heard this from a lot of commentators, especially from folks who worked directly on this statute and drafting it, that perhaps the intent of the statute was really to provide for experienced operators, and by experienced, that means, I think probably we can surmise, you actually have experience operating. You've actually been doing it. So my intent in opening this and reopening it is really to make sure that we understand as we're moving forward what we are doing here, and to provide the opportunity for commissioners to weigh that and decide, whether we are comfortable, given, I think you can argue that this statute, may not be very tightly hemmed in.
Be careful.
that there's interpretations, and that happens. I think rarely are there statutes where you can't find multiple interpretations, or look for things, and so what our interpretation is, we are given deference as the regulatory agency. In many ways, we obviously have to hew to what the intent of the statute is, or really try to find that intent. That is what we have been given as a mandate by the legislature, and that's what we should be doing. But now we're kind of left in this area of, okay, well, let's define what this means, and so I would just open it back up. And
I first of all, thank you very much for raising the issue. I think it's an important one to discuss, so let's do that. Commissioner Tyler.
I just want to say, Commissioner McBride, thank you for opening it. I completely support your initial interpretation in terms of the...
Can you be specific?
Sure. Your initial interpretation in terms of the first section that you read relating to priority. I think that's quite clear. And then the second section that you read relating to accreditation and the need for materials to be submitted. So I think you were absolutely on point.
Not sure what that, are you recommending that we stay with our original intent, which was to prioritize both final and provisional licensees?
Yes.
Okay, I want to understand that. Other comments or questions? Commissioner Doyle?
I think I'd have a hard time getting around the second sentence of section 73B, because it does say shall consider issuance of a provisional or final certificate of registration as achievement of accreditation status. So where we may have that wiggle room is the order in which they're ultimately prioritized within that relatively large subgroup. So.
Is there a specific suggestion you're making, or I can, Commissioner?
No, I mean, in trying to recollect what we did in December, and that's all a blur, right, and kind of how it came together. But as the person who drafted that section of it, that this is, I failed yesterday to read this section. I think that it was a very relevant, important section, and that language that Commissioner Doyle pointed out is sort of what my linchpin was.
Okay.
So again, the reason I'm bringing this up is just to make sure that we're clear on what we are agreeing to, and that we do agree that accreditation is the factor that we're looking at.
Go ahead, Commissioner Tyler.
So the way I read this is accreditation status then ensures an expedited review process, not priority, which is the word used earlier. And it explains it's because the applicants only need to submit specific information because they've already submitted others. That makes perfect sense to me. If people feel, and I don't know if this needs to be a regulatory decision, but this kind of is what I was envisioning, that expedited means we may even take that first within our previously expected parameters because it will be a more efficient process. I think that's fine.
So,
that's the way the regulation is drafted currently.
Okay, so then that was my question. So right now, I think there's consensus that we do not need to change the regulation as drafted.
Right.
So therefore, there's no need to vote, if I'm correct. Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner McBride.
Thank you for letting me raise it.
No, please. Okay, there was a question that Commissioner Doyle was trying to get some clarity from DPH, which is that if RMDs apply for and receive an adult use license, what is the process for transferring inventory?
Yes.
Are we ready to talk about that, do you think, Commissioner Doyle?
If we could postpone that till the end, I just
You got it?
wanna make sure I at least.
Okay, so I think we are now in environmental requirements. I think we can't adopt that any longer.
Would it be
Okay.
possible for me to raise another issue?
Of course, no, we want to, obviously, we want to get done today, but we want to get done completely. So
Okay.
we'll just talk about whatever we need to talk about. So go ahead, Commissioner Tuttle.
Okay, let me just pull it up. This is related to the application process. One second. This has to do with documentation required, that the that the marijuana establishment is in compliance with local zoning ordinances.
Okay.
And so this is not a suggested change to the actual policy, because there's no question that the marijuana establishment needs to be in compliance with local zoning. However, it has to do with the requirement that we added where the applicant would have to submit documentation, which shall include but may not be limited to a certification from the municipality in which the marijuana establishment will be located. And we got feedback on this from several applicants and people who represent applicants, that it would be very difficult to get that certification. And that's not a statutorily required certification, and that's very consistent with my own experience as well. So I wanted to bring up that we should eliminate that requirement for proactive documentation or certification, and instead leave the original requirement, which was that the municipality would have a certain time period to bring up if the establishment was not in compliance with zoning. Does that make sense the way I presented it?
I think there is a certain duplication there. I mentioned this back in December, I think. The risk actually of not having that certification is going to be borne by the applicant, because the potential problem is that they will go on their merry way, invest a lot of money in developing their application and spending time on it, and then at the very last hurdle, fall because the town or city has not agreed that they're in compliance with zoning. Due to the packet system, it may be relatively towards the end anyway, but the idea, sort of similar to the community outreach meeting, which I'm sure is also similarly warmly received, is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because there was a situation in the medical program where people didn't pay enough close attention to zoning compliance and discovered at the last second that the facility was not going to be compliant with zoning, and everything had to be undone. And so I was trying to put that in there to push that issue forward, and honestly it's applicant protection more than municipal protection.
So my recommendation there would be that we address that in the guidance and let the businesses take that risk, because they shouldn't be moving forward if they're not in compliance with zoning. It's really not, I don't have an issue with the substance, that obviously they need to be in the right place. It's really just that, similar to some of the discussions yesterday, just that process of getting some kind of certification can be very, very difficult and could just hold up an application.
I'll just say it gives me nervousness on behalf of the applicants, because zoning is so complicated. It's an obscure area. It requires a really good review of bylaws and ordinances, and my hope was to get people in the municipality and in the business together to make sure that everybody was on the same page. And I realize, there's
I'm in alignment with Commissioner Turner on this, which is I think that we need to treat applicants and prospective business owners as adults. And I think guidance is great, but I think, if people want to apply for a license, I think we need to assume that, and hope that they're going to follow the process and understand understand the process and follow the guidance. So I don't see, I think that's a little bit of a nanny state kind of thing to do, in my opinion.
I'm gonna
Yeah, please.
beg to differ there.
I
I completely
state.
agree that that businesses need to accept risks and
Right.
need to be willing to take on those risks. And so this comment is not at all with regard to that.
Right.
This is, I'm being very selfish here, this is
Please.
purely with regard to our issuing of licenses and our ability to not get stuck where we are not sure about the lay of the land and whether there's compliance or not, and how, I guess, practically speaking, and I would put this out there for the commission, I welcome feedback, but I think it's indicative of what we need to be thinking about in terms of our process, which we're building right now. How then are we checking on this if we're not asking for it up front and having something that is a document that we refer to, that we take, it's a credible, reliable document.
Yeah.
So then how do we do it? Are we reaching out to the towns, and are we as a licensing entity talking, going to the towns and saying, are they in compliance? I mean, what does it create in terms of our ability to move quickly through a licensing process and make sure that we're licensing, right? And that we're not getting into a situation where on, at the 11:59, we're like handing the license and, oh, wait a minute, it turns out, no, you're not. So I think that puts businesses in it puts businesses in a bad position, but selfishly, I think it puts us in, it creates just a tornado of administrative issues for us.
No, I think that's compelling.
That is addressed in the statute. I'll just find it.
Okay.
Or you could go on a comment because it might take me a minute.
This would be a good time for me to invite folks to speak into the microphones as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Executive Director.
Thank you.
I was looking for my opening.
Apparently, I'm gonna get an
We'll get to it.
email. Yeah,
At the appropriate time, we got to
so I think computer keeps freezing, as I was saying, maybe more time.
Okay. Susan. No, no. That's mine.
I'm really close to that.
Okay, because I.
I'm in the right section.
Yeah, we're getting toward, well, I'm going in now.
If I don't find it within like 60 seconds. you can-
Okay.
Government at work.
Sorry, I don't have the whole thing memorized.
Okay. Do you want to take a break?
Yeah.
Okay.
Honestly, it's hot in here.
10-minute break.
I honestly think it's a
Yeah, so that's 11:14, please.
So much.
We'll reconvene. Thank you. Okay, we're back in session.
Commissioner Tuttle, I believe you had the floor before we break.
I did. So, and I've been asked to keep the microphone closer. So is that better? People hear me? All right. So section 5 of our enabling statute, licensing of marijuana establishments. The application process is laid out there, and it has several items that would occur within 90 days upon receipt of a complete marijuana establishment license application and the application fee. The Commission shall forward a copy of the application to the city or town in which the marijuana establishment is to be located, determine whether the applicant and the premises qualify for the license and has complied with this chapter, and shall, within 90 days, and I'll skip to B, the Commission shall approve a marijuana establishment license application and issue a license if, and I'll skip to number 2, the Commission is not notified by the city or town in which the proposed marijuana establishment will be located that the proposed marijuana establishment is not in compliance with an ordinance or bylaw consistent with section 3 of this chapter and in effect at the time of application. And so this gets to the same result, but there is no proactive need for documentation.
And Commissioner McBride?
I imagine that municipalities will be thrilled to have one less burden on them. I am comfortable moving ahead with that interpretation. I will state that I'm not sure in the probably rare, hopefully rare event that there is an issue raised by a municipality possibly down the line, like quite a bit down the line. In other words, on the eve of our issuing a license. If there's something raised, I'm not sure how we're going to address that and what our protocol is going to be for what we do in that circumstance. So I think that's something that we need to think about. This does, ever so slightly muddy the water for us a bit, but that's something that we can put our heads together, I guess, and try to address, talk to the general counsel, and try to figure out what it's going to mean for us. If, my concern is that we will have gotten 99.9% of the way there. We will have done our due diligence. We will be on the eve of issuance, and that, on that morning, we really would be issuing a license. We're not going to be issuing a license because we're going to have some concerns that we still need to address. But if that's what ends up happening, then so be it. It's a good day for the municipalities.
I think the specific that specific situation was contemplated in the way it was written that would happen within 90 days. So there's not like an open time frame within which that can happen.
So if I understand the conversation correctly, we're going to just leave the existing, we'll leave the existing regulation in place?
No, I think we're going to strike it.
Strike the requirement of certification.
Yeah, documentation that the marijuana establishment is in compliance with local zoning ordinances.
Okay. Can I have a further conversation or discussion on that? Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Tyler made a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan, I believe, if I heard correctly. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that was unanimously approved by the Commission. Thank you. I do believe we should move into the environmental and energy regulations that were proposed. I appreciate Commissioner Doyle's willingness to defer the conversation until today. I did read through this last night. I'm actually comfortable with the recommendations. My one issue is should we waive these regulations for any category of business? Just given, again, our desire not to place undue economic burdens on some of the small participants in this industry, but other than that, which I'd like to discuss and get comments and thoughts from the other commissioners, I'm comfortable with these recommendations.
My recommendation in response to your question would be rather than waiving entire categories of business, then allowing the applicants or registrants or licensees to request waivers from specific provisions, because I don't want to assume that they can't do it. I think we should take it on a case-by-case basis.
I'm very comfortable with that. Other comments or thoughts on this? Commissioner Turner?
In general, I support the recommendations, and I want to thank the EEA for the time that they took to meet with us and share their expertise. I have a couple tweaks. One of them is related to certain licensees. I think we should give them a little bit of wiggle room, and I have a proposal on that. And then secondly, I would suggest that we add a requirement for collecting the energy and water use.
That's in, yeah, I think.
And they added that?
Well, no, they didn't add that, but that, we skipped over that. That was one of the topics that we skipped over pending this conversation, so I think we can go right back into that. So let's talk about the first issue that you suggested in terms of exemption or waivers. Would you make your proposal? Or?
Yeah, if you don't mind going to slide 10.
I don't know if, can you do that, Mary Alice? Thank you.
So my suggestion is just that we make a slight tweak for the, thank you very much, that we make a slight tweak for Tier 1 and Tier 2, aka micro businesses, to give them a little more room. So currently the recommendation is 36 watts per square foot. And if you can see up in the upper right corner, 62.5 is basically what it would be if we weren't making any kind of standard here. So that's what we're trying to avoid. If you look at the rest of them, 36.5 is the average watts, but you can see all the way on the right that that's 51. And then you see the one at the top, I'm about a third in, that's 54. And these are all the different LED fixtures. So my recommendation would be that for Tier 1 and Tier 2, instead of 36 watts per square foot, we allow 50, and that still keeps them in that range, but it allows them some more flexibility to work within their budget. And I think that's a good idea as a policy matter because they are smaller, so of course, by definition, their use of energy is smaller, and so I don't think it would have a big impact. And then secondly, even though I'm persuaded that it's a smarter financial move to make these investments up front and that it will pay off in the long run, these smaller businesses are much more likely to have less capital, and so even if it's a good financial decision, they may not have the ability to make that investment up front. So I think it's very much in line with the principles, but just takes into account the difficulties that small businesses may have, especially in the beginning.
Any thoughts on that?
I actually just have a question. Do we know if that's achievable? Can they do the 54.2? I mean, I know it's there. Is this, and this is me not totally understanding the chart, is the 50 number generated by LED or HID?
So the HID number is a 62.5, and all of the rest are related to different types of LEDs.
LEDs.
Okay, the 51.3 is on LEDs. Okay. Do we know what the impact of doing that will be on their climate compliance goals? You know, because we have to, as a state, we have to meet the requirement of the act.
Right, so that's the point of doing this for the smaller businesses, because their impact on those goals is going to be much smaller than the big facilities.
Yeah, no, I just didn't know if you had a chance to ask them, you know,
If I had a chance to ask who?
the EA.
Oh, they're in the room, I think, if you want to weigh in, Tony? You don't have to.
Obviously,
Would you mind coming up and speaking to one of the microphones, please? Thank you, by the way. Sorry to put you on the spot. I think there's a microphone right here if you want it at the front table. Just if you can just drag it a little closer to you, please. Again, thank you for...
So my name is Antonio Barletta. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Government Affairs for the Department of Energy Resources. And here with me is Alex Pollard, who's our Energy Efficiency Deputy Director. Maybe just gave you a promotion, but so Commissioner Title is correct in the fact that the smaller facilities we anticipate would have a less of an impact on our GWSA goals, and thus having a higher LED requirement, or not LED requirement, but light power density requirement, might not have as much of an effect as a larger facility would. And yes, those are all LEDs that are underneath the 62.5.
Right. Any other additional comments?
No, I think Tony got it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So other comments or questions about Commissioner Title's suggestion?
So, just to make sure I'm understanding it, it would be, and I think EEA in a follow-up email to what has been said to us in this slide, had also said something like, submitted some additional language that would also soften that 36 square foot, so it would be an average rather than.
Yes.
Yes. So, so it would be.
So this is a change to the recommendations that we were just showing?
It's very minimally
Okay, but
different.
let's just make sure
Yeah,
that just for clarity,
it's-
so we'll get back to that in a second. Go ahead.
Okay. It's more a language discussion next week than a policy.
Okay.
thing. I mean, we're generally going, the recommendation is to go with what EEA is recommending, with subject to, you know, language adjustment by the commission in response to further comments.
And the exemption suggested by
And
Commissioner
yes,
Title.
and the exempt.
Or not exemption, but alternative standard suggested by Commissioner Title.
Yeah, so is that's essentially for the smaller tiers, which is, it's up to 5,000 square feet. You're suggesting that they be allowed to do a lighting power density of 51 watts, did I get that right? 51?
I suggested 50.
50, sorry, 50 square feet, I just wanna make sure I understand what I'm putting.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank
And
you.
just to clarify one further point, I don't anticipate any grandfathering in. And so if it's a business decision they have to make, that if they plan to grow and go into the higher tiers,
Right.
then they have to decide if they're going to invest up front. But they would be subject to the same.
Right.
And
Sorry,
go ahead,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was just, I don't read this, did we discuss, or should we discuss and agree to, is there speaking of grandfathering, is there a grandfather for current
Yes.
cultivators?
So EEA had suggested a phase-in approach of, I believe it was a year to phase in
Okay,
compliance.
that's very important to get to the regulations, so we'll make sure.
And I think they, provided some language for
Okay,
us.
great. Are there any other comments or suggestions to approving this with the amendment suggested by Commissioner Title and the clarification suggested by Commissioner Doyle?
As amended by Commissioner, yes.
Okay. So can I have a motion then to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Flanagan made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that this was approved unanimously. Thank you, and again, thank you to EEA for all your help in this matter. Back to the second point, Commissioner Title, if we can get back to, thank you, Mary Alice. Okay, so we dealt with this issue. There was a previous issue that we skipped that I just want to get back to that relates to Commissioner Title's suggestion, which is, again, this is in cultivation and it is requiring data collection and submission regarding energy and water usage. I believe that is your second suggestion.
Yes, and I think it's obvious why we want that data. If there's any concern, then I'll go into it more. But the suggestion is that along with renewal, the licensee would submit a document which would include a survey and the necessary data to determine their energy and water use. And a way to demonstrate that would be through their utility bills. So I suggest we add that so we can keep track of the energy being used by our licensees.
Any objections or concerns? Okay, can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
So I think Commissioner Flanagan won that, so the record show Commissioner Flanagan made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that this was approved unanimously by the Commission. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do fees later just because I need some more time over lunch. Are we able to discuss the inventory transfer issue for RMDs that apply for and receive an adult use license?
I believe we are. have.
Thank you, by the way, I want to thank Commissioner Doyle for dogging this one.
What I propose, we had received public comment saying it just wasn't clear under the draft regulations that marijuana establishments that are also registered marijuana dispensaries would be able to transfer their inventory, so to speak, from medical to adult as they get started. And I just, as DPH is very much part of that conversation,
Sure.
even though I think there are regulations in the statute, or there's statutory language on this subject, just wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. So I would propose that we do something essentially along the lines of subject to DPH approval, allowing registered marijuana dispensaries to transfer inventory to themselves in their capacity as a marijuana establishment, subject to that, oh sorry.
It's 35%.
It's 35% reserved for marijuana patients.
Can you just explain the logic for DPH, subject to DPH approval?
Well, it will somewhat depend on the timing, so that particular regulation will change when we take over the medical use of marijuana program.
But since we don't have a timeline for that yet.
Yes, so I think we just, in the meantime, have to recognize that this is inventory being transferred under, inventory that is under DPH's authorization right now in jurisdiction and being transferred to adult use. So I think they need to be part of the conversation, and they have agreed to that.
Okay. Questions or comments? So can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Seconded.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Doyle made a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Title. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that this was approved unanimously by the Commission. Thank you. We've talked about environmental requirements. So we're in pretty good shape. If I can get back. Here's the last, this is the last slide. Number of issues on this slide, but this is the last slide. I am going to ask for a little time over lunch, so I think we'll go through lunch, take a lunch break, and come back, just because I need to do a little more work on the fees. So if we can cover these issues in whatever time it takes, take a short lunch break and then come back. I think we can finalize the fee and tiering, and then I think that concludes the agenda. So oh yeah, no, I'm sorry, there are a few other additions that have come up over the last little while. We'll cover those as well. Let's cover this slide first. So one topic is renaming the special regulations for Martha's Vineyard and just calling them regulations for Dukes and Nantucket County. Is there any issue with that?
No.
Can I have a motion therefore to approve?
So moved.
Second.
I'm sorry, didn't hear a second. Okay, let the record show Commissioner Doyle made a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that was unanimously approved. Inspections and compliance, I'm sorry that this was not one that I put in there, so can somebody explicate the recommendation here? Anybody want to take ownership of this?
I don't know what it is.
Okay. Thank you.
For consideration, I don't know if you wanted to.
I'd like it to, if you could you actually explicate the issue for us?
Do you want me to pull up the testimony? You know all the testimony from the UFCW dealing with compliance issues from like a workforce perspective. I don't know if you want to take a break to look at them, but I wasn't prepared to.
Okay, sorry.
How you had thought about this.
I can take this.
Go ahead, Commissioner Connell. Thank you, Mary. I'll start to put you on the spot.
I'm just going off my memory here from a meeting with them, but they had raised a number of concerns about worker protection. And given that's something that is addressed in almost every other industry and wasn't particularly addressed here, although there's some protections for personal protection equipment and things like that. I would suggest, even though we already have, I know, too many working groups, I would suggest the creation of an additional working group on worker protections.
Could we throw that to the advisory board rather than create a new group?
Sure.
Got it. It's just requiring a vote. General Counsel? Pardon?
You're not creating it for regulation,
No.
so no.
I'll just take it as a charge.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Executive Director.
Secret shopper program, expanding scope to be broader, including underage ID checks, et cetera.
That's me.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Doyle.
Thank you. So in the course of public comments, a number of commenters asked that the secret shopper program be expanded beyond what it was originally drafted as, which is an opportunity for testing, to make clear that it was broader than that and include underage ID checks so that we could send in, work with people to go in, try to buy, even though they look very young, and not have sufficient ID, and see whether or not a marijuana establishment will sell it. And so I think that would be a good thing. I think it enhances compliance.
Any disagreement, or, then can we have a motion, please, to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Let the record show that that was unanimously approved by the commission. Thank you. I'm not aware of any issues or suggestions with respect to grounds for denial, hearings and appeals, non-conflict, and waivers. Am I correct in that? Okay. Then the next issue is with respect to suitability, .800. Is this something Commissioner McBride will address?
Yep.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take these actually in reverse order. So the first issue is discretion. There was a recommendation made by a few commentators that the regulations are missing general discretion language, and I think that it's a point that's well taken. So discretion language is a cornerstone of administrative law and regulatory agencies like the CNB. And courts largely recognize agency discretion on the belief that agencies tasked with regulation develop expertise, and courts give opinion of regulatory agencies' validity and weight. Now, that's sort of the legal basis of it. The practical basis of discretionary language is really because we, even as we look at these regulations and try to put in as much language to provide us with access to information, to request information from applicants and licensees, to be able to look at a full application, even under the best of circumstances, producing the most forms and the most detailed forms. The reality is that there are situations that we just are not going to foresee. And a big part of what we're doing here as a regulatory entity is trying to be proactive in making sure that we are obtaining the right information. But we can't forget that we also are going to be judged, and our regulatory authority and ability to sensibly regulate an industry that's going to be sustainable is really going to be based on the way that we react to situations as well. We don't have to look very far to see circumstances and instances where discretion is really important, and the ability to look closely at information that comes to light that could not perhaps have come to light during an application process becomes really important as to the suitability of an applicant or the suitability of a licensee. And we are in a very different place today than even we were 10 years ago. I mean, that information is going to come to light. So this is really us trying, this is for my recommendation, is that we try to anticipate that we don't enter into this naively under the belief that everything is going to be perfect. Things are going to go wrong.
You said that yesterday as well.
Yeah, they're going to. If you've been around administrative agencies and you've been involved in regulation, you've been involved in government, I have spent my career in government, you do the best that you can, but you have to plan for that rainy day. And you've got to plan for how you're going to respond when it comes along. And it's really hard to plan when you can't foresee it. So, as the information comes to light, you should give yourself the tools to be able to respond to it. That's what this proposal does. It incorporates with a standard of credible and reliable evidence that the commission, with the under really the direction of the executive director and a suitability review committee, would be able to take in information that comes to light and be able to react to that information and provide a recommendation to the commission on what the appropriate action might be. So this comes into play certainly when I think we are talking about information that comes to light. It also comes into play when we're talking about a basis for if there may be a negative suitability determination, and really providing the staff, which would at that level be the individuals under the direction of the executive director, with the appropriate guidance on how to move ahead with looking at suitability in the event that information comes to light that or is provided during the application process that gives us pause and causes us to say, we want to know a little bit more about this, because it might tip the balance towards licensing. It might tip the balance towards not revoking something. But we need to be able to get in that information and do it in a way that facilitates a decision on our part.
So without getting into the actual specific regulatory language, can you just be a little bit more precise or help me understand exactly what that regulation would look like?
So a lot of agencies here in Massachusetts and a lot of agencies around the country use this terminology, which I have a real aversion to, which is quote-unquote good moral character. I think that terminology is certainly antiquated, and I have it's really troubling to me. So I would prefer that we be looking at it as to what is practically what we're trying to get at. And so it would be whether the information that has come to light indicates, and again, I'm going to go back, this is based on credible, reliable, written information that's submitted to the commission. This isn't just dropping a dime and calling us, and we call in. So this is a real, substantive, credible, reliable information that the applicant's or registrant's prior actions pose a risk to public health, safety, or welfare, or indicate that the applicant would likely pose a risk to public health, safety, or welfare if the registration or license is granted or renewed. That's one. Second is that the applicant or registrant's prior actions would indicate that they would likely act in a manner that's inconsistent with the purposes of this act, our enabling act, or that the applicant or registrant's prior actions indicate that they are not suitable for registration or licensure.
That's my question, which is suitable.
Yeah. So,
because I personally, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So when we look at suitability, and we talked about this in December, we set forth a process where we would have, it would not be at a commission level, it would be at a staff level, a suitability review committee.
Right.
I wouldn't propose putting it in the regulations because, quite frankly, I think it's really going to be determined by the circumstances as to what the appropriate makeup of that committee may be, and it would fall to the executive director and senior staff to figure out what is the appropriate makeup going to be. I would suggest, in the instance of looking at a negative suitability determination where it might be one of the standards for registration, something like that, or licensure, that maybe we would want to have on there our community outreach person. Maybe we would want to have on there our chief of investigations and enforcement. Maybe we'd want to have on there a human resources person.
I was asking a different question. I appreciate that, but I was asking a different question, or trying to at least. Do you feel that suitability is well enough defined in the regulations that we drafted and adopted, or draft regulations in December? Suitability is well enough defined to fit into what you just articulated, or do we need to do further definition? I'm not sure I agree with you in terms of your good moral character. I understand your concerns about that. My concern is that suitability is well enough understood that it doesn't get subject to
So I think that there is a level, this discretion language actually feeds very squarely into the suitability piece of it.
Okay.
There is definitely a level of discretion that is undertaken by whoever is tasked with making that determination, whatever group of people are tasked with making that determination when it happens. But what we would be doing in these regulations would be saying we're putting these parameters around what that determination should look like and the information that should be taken into consideration when you are looking at it. In addition to that, we would be issuing, I think, very succinct guidelines and protocols to a suitability review committee about what would be taken into consideration, how it would be used, and then how a recommendation would be forthcoming and how that would be made to us in the event that one needed to be made to us. Now, what we need to remember, or what I would, I guess, ask the commission to remember, is that these instances should be rare. They're going to be rare instances where if we are doing our job and we're providing bright lines and are being diligent about what we're doing, the more bright lines we can provide for applicants and licensees, the more able applicants and licensees are going to be to get through our process and to be able to successfully start and then maintain an operational, successful business. So these instances should be the rarest of instances. And so if we have to talk about it kind of in these terms, and it's a really weighty issue to be talking about, and I think it's a really weighty issue, and I think everyone needs to be very sensitive to that fact of what we're talking about here is essentially having a level of trust and a level of accountability with this commission that we need to be able to kind of carry forth this weight and make these decisions. But by adopting a standard, we're going to be giving ourselves the tool to be able to address issues as they come up. Are there any other?
Thanks. Thank you very much. Do we have comments or questions on that?
Not for me.
Commissioner Thomas?
Do you want to go?
Nope, go ahead.
Are we taking these together?
Yes.
Okay. First, I just want to thank Commissioner McBride for taking my concerns raised Monday into account. I think similar to the discussion we had yesterday about law enforcement review, I think it's exactly what was intended when this commission was made, that you have the experience of someone who has been in a regulatory agency and understands what these needs are, with the respect of the context in this case, where for decades people have been looking to the uniqueness of this particular registration and license as it relates to the group of people who are not able to get business licenses, jobs, housing, student loans, etc. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that, and in particular, aside from the substantive issue, looking at the will of the voters, the way that ultimately the bill was written, it changed throughout the legislative process, and there was a very strong vocal, vocalized concept that we need to be very careful about the way that this discretion is exercised. So with all of that said, I read the language. I think that it is narrow in scope. I think it is specific. I think it is very well written to address the concerns that I just raised and to balance those two needs. I generally support it. Just a couple of tweaks on the denial of a registration card. I would suggest a change, and I'll read the language as it is now and then suggest my change. Other grounds each of the following in and of itself constitutes full and adequate grounds for denial of a registration card for a marijuana establishment agent. Number 6, other grounds as the commission may determine in the exercise of its discretion that make the applicant unsuitable for registration. However, the commission will provide notice to the applicant of the grounds prior to the denial and a reasonable opportunity to correct these grounds. So my concern there is how broad it is, because I feel confident moving that forward with this commission and this executive director, but I don't know in the future what it will look like. And so I feel that the grounds needs to be more specific. I would suggest that we add other grounds related to the ability of the applicant to serve as a marijuana establishment agent. And then I would also suggest, and I don't have strong feelings about how, that we be more specific as to who is making this decision. I would suggest perhaps the executive director, the commissioners themselves, or a suitability committee. But the way it's written now as the commission, I feel like that could be any staff person.
I think that's fair, and in all of these contexts, it is intended to be a suitability review committee that would be separate and apart from the 5 of us. And the hope is that with appropriate protocols and guidance and what we've written into the regulations already, that in many instances they'll be able to sort of get through that analysis pretty readily and make, come to a good recommendation. Where it's a closer call, perhaps, and there's maybe a split or something, those may be a circumstance where it has to be escalated. But I think that it's a point that's well taken to be more specific in here about that.
How do you feel about just adding that suitability review committee and then saying as defined in, and then referring to the other section?
So I'm looking at our general counsel. Does that make?
Yeah, we can work on language that I think would be similar to the language that's put in elsewhere in the discretionary mechanism.
And then how do you feel about the suggestion to make the conduct related to their ability to serve as an agent?
So the questions. I'm mulling it over. I'm trying honestly to think about, facts make bad law. Kind of like I'm trying to think about sort of like the outlying and where I'm trying to think of like the possible situations or examples of them. So the question is about for the general counsel relating the other grounds to the ability of the applicant to serve as a registration, a marijuana establishment agent, registered marijuana establishment agent. Because it's a denial of a registration card, sure. I think that makes sense to do that. It's a very specific provision, so I think that makes sense.
Just one more thing. I just want to really thank you for not putting in the antiquated language, because I know there was a big push to do that. So thank you.
This is I think that a big part of what we should be doing it is marbling throughout our regulations and really, embracing that we need to be moving forward and we need to be progressive in our approach and try to be as progressive as we can within the bounds of law and what we're given. But we need to be try to create a path forward.
Okay, so I think that the motion on the table, I'd like a motion to approve the language suggested by Commissioner McBride with the amended language of Commissioner Kyle.
So moved.
Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that that has been approved unanimously by the Commission. Is there's a second issue here, Commissioner McBride? Or are we?
So there are a couple. One is it's sort of a purely administrative matter, and that is giving definition to what we included in the suitability standards on violent crime, which is included in all of the tables for standards for both licensees and also for registered agents. It's not so much an issue for the licensees because there are strict prohibitions in the statute that we need to hew to. But for the registration agent, it's adopting two citations that are commonly used as the definition of what is considered to be violent crime, and they are included in Chapter 140, Section 121 of the General Laws, and Chapter 127, Section 133E of the General Laws. I think that it's useful to be able to give context to what we're talking about, particularly if we are asking a suitability committee that could be a revolving group of people to be able to provide a level of context for them. So.
Okay. Any comments? Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner McBride made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that was approved unanimously by the Commission.
So the final issue under suitability is one that I will take ownership of. It was an oversight by me when we were putting this together in December, and it was one that I should have included for consideration and did not. So I'm going to ask that it be considered now by the Commission, and it is that we add narcotics trafficking crimes, except where the statute requires otherwise. So for solely marijuana related. Or Chapter 94C, Section 34 crimes as a mandatory disqualification for marijuana establishment registration, agent registration. The reason that I'm asking for this is that this is different than simple possession. It's different even than distribution. This is really talking about quantity and significant quantity of drugs like fentanyl, meth, cocaine, drugs that kill people. And I firmly believe that someone who has that level of offense should be prohibited from operating as a marijuana establishment agent. And it really is purely as a matter of providing access. And so I believe we do need to have a bright line on this, particularly in a post-Cole memorandum world where we are going to be in a different position than many states that have gone before us. We live in a state where it's not a matter of hours, it's in under an hour you can be over the border into a different state. We are the first state on the East Coast to really be this far along, or at least New England to be this far along in our regulatory structure, and I think it puts us in a different place that requires us to look very closely at suitability.
So, I'm sorry, could you just repeat the specifics of your proposal with respect to this automatic criteria for disqualification?
We'd add narcotics trafficking crimes, except where the statute requires otherwise, so not for solely marijuana related or Chapter 94C, Section 34, which are possession crimes, as a mandatory disqualification for an indefinite period of time for marijuana establishment agents.
Flanagan?
I agree with Commissioner McBride. I think that this is obviously a difficult conversation to have. But I think when you start talking about the issue of trafficking and the fact that it's gone through our court system, we need to really take a look at that level of activity here in Massachusetts. We have a drug problem in Massachusetts. We've had a significant drug problem that I've worked on for years in the state. And I think while this commission has done amazing work in putting forth equity provisions into our draft regulations, social justice issues into our draft regulations, ensuring that people who have possession crimes and who have been disproportionately affected by the drug laws in Massachusetts are going to be able to partake in that. For me, trafficking is a non-starter. I think that there's a very large difference between someone who had been picked up for possession and someone who has actively been trafficking in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Certainly, we're trying to balance all of this, and I think that we've done a good job doing that. And I applaud Commissioner McBride for the work that she's done on this, and it's not easy to sit up here and to say that you want to disqualify someone based upon a certain crime, but when it comes down to it, and you look at the levels, the amounts of product that you need to be considered for trafficking, I think that goes well beyond the intent of what we're trying to do, and trying to include people into this market. And for me, you know, the question I've been asking myself is, how low is this bar going to go for us to let people into this market? I mean, we need to have some level of attainability where people need to work hard and to be part of this, because it is a legal market here. And the voters did pass it by the question. The legislature did vote on Chapter 55. I will take every criticism in the book when it comes to the votes that we've taken here and the job that we've done, but I think that for me, if you're trafficking, then you're in a whole different category, and I don't feel bad about the disqualification of that.
Can you, for my edification, I won't cast aspersions on anybody else, but for my edification, can I understand, you said trafficking is a whole new level.
It's different than possession.
No, but can I understand the legal definition? I mean, it sounded like you were saying trafficking is different than other distribution, or is?
No, it's different than possession. It's
But,
different.
okay, but
It's also different. It's also, it depends on so under federal law,
Yep.
distribution is sort of the term that is used, but under state law, it's a matter of quantity, where you kind of draw the line between distribution. Trafficking is a higher quantity
And
of
your
controlled substance.
proposal is to exclude trafficking?
Yes, except for,
Marijuana
right?
only.
Except for solely marijuana related, and
Yes.
you know, where otherwise. So, to be fair, the 94C 34 that's not gonna be, there are no trafficking issues there. But for solely marijuana related,
Mhm.
now I'm gonna acknowledge there that the amount of product that you would have, and that there would be evidence of you having possession of, that would ratchet this up to a trafficking
Mhm.
conviction,
Yes.
if it's marijuana, is significant. And there are people in this room that know far more about how much 50 pounds of marijuana is than I do and what it looks like. But that's sort of where we're starting. That's a lot. And so we're not, if it's solely marijuana, I am acknowledging that this.
I'm just trying to make sure I'm following.
Yeah,
this
but I
conversation.
guess I'm trying to acknowledge that I understand the directive that we're given in the statute, and I understand moving ahead and trying to move ahead. So it's taking that off the table, but saying where there are other controlled substances that are dangerous.
Right.
They're dangerous controlled substances, and that my
you guys
suggestion
are
is
right.
that qualifies it as it's a significant difference between a possession and distribution, and then getting to the level of a trafficking offense.
I understand, thank you. Can I have other comments or questions?
I have some comments.
Please go ahead, Commissioner Tuttle.
So is this what is listed under the agenda as specific DQ criteria? Or how is this listed in the agenda? And what does DQ
Yes.
stand for?
Disqualification.
Mandatory disqualification.
Okay, so this is the first I'm hearing of this suggestion, so I just want to be very clear that we're having this conversation on the fly, on the third day of discussions at noon, so okay, let's do that. This has been discussed from the very beginning of this process, who will be disqualified on a mandatory basis. No one is trying to take away discretion from employers. So we're talking about agent registration specifically, right? So to be an agent, you would still have to go through the entire process of getting hired, and you would still have to go through the background check process. You would still be subject to the catch-all provision we just added. And on top of that, we want to mandatorily disqualify people for narcotics-related trafficking crimes, except where the statute requires otherwise. Is that what we're suggesting here? Okay. So first of all, I just want to recognize everyone, including the people in the room, who made the statute specifically exempt marijuana-related crimes, or else certainly that would be included here as well. We would be trying to disqualify them, but we can't. So people with marijuana-related offenses will not be disqualified no matter what happens in this conversation. My next question is narcotics trafficking crimes. It's not just the scary drugs we just talked about. It would be a lot longer list. Can we discuss the actual law we're referring to and go through all of the drugs that are listed there and what the convictions would be, since I wasn't prepared to have this conversation?
Sure.
You want to, should we stop, or do you want to finish your points and then let's come back and talk about how we address them? Or it's up to you.
I think I made my point, which is that we should be, as a matter of principle, going through each conviction, which would then be a mandatory disqualification, and describe why, and also consider all the reasons why a person might have such a violation on their record versus someone else who may have had a good lawyer or live in a certain area or for another reason not have that crime on their record. So let's be aware of that difference. And then let's look at the equity program that we passed in terms of the qualifications for the economic empowerment of communities disproportionately impacted by high rates of arrest and incarceration for offenses under the Controlled Substances Act, which include as one factor out of 6 that at least 51% of employees or contractors have drug-related CORI, that requirement would now require an employer to find people who meet that and qualify under the law and would get hired but are not mandatorily disqualified over what's being proposed now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that we take our lunch break and get, because I do think that, to your point, Commissioner Title, this is a new topic. I think that it's appropriate, or it's a new topic.
This is not, if people read the comments, this was raised in the comments, people responded.
Okay.
I just want to, people respond, this is not a new topic that is coming out of the blue, and also has been on here for the last 3 days. So,
Okay.
I
Fair.
keep, you know.
DQ
guys.
criteria is
Okay,
quite
so
general.
I would like to suggest we take our lunch break now. We'll get into this right after lunch. I think I'd like people to have some time to think about this. I'm not going to make a value judgment about new or not, but I think we all need some time to reflect, and then we'll come back and get into it. I think Commissioner Title's suggestion that we go through this statute in detail, I think is an appropriate one. So we probably need a little prep to do that. So I'm going to suggest that we break and come back and get this topic in. Just for everybody's edification, let me just be clear about, there's not a whole lot else to do, but I just want to make sure everybody knows what else we have to do besides this topic, and make sure everybody's comfortable that we can take a break and come back to this. So there really are a very small handful of topics that are not on this agenda because they've come up more recently, so these are new. One is an issue with respect to responsible vendors, which I'm going to defer to Commissioner McBride on.
Nope.
Oh, Commissioner Doyle.
Yep.
So can you just briefly, just what is the issue there?
Oh, sure. It was, we approved a responsible vendor program back in December, and due to drafting error of mine, the details of it were not included in the regulations, just the reference to it.
Okay.
And so I just wanted to refresh everyone's memory and make sure everyone's comfortable with the details going in the regulations.
Okay.
So that's one topic. Fees we've talked about, referred to, so just for everybody's application. So there's really two topics on fees and tiers. One is a suggestion that we put in more tiers, particularly at the higher levels of cultivation, to make this relegation process and the moving up as well as moving down process, I think, a little bit more actionable. There's also something I already talked about, but we haven't formally discussed or voted on, which is the idea of adding an incremental fee for co-ops based upon having more than 6 locations. So I think that's pretty much it that we need to discuss on fees. The other topic that is a more recent topic, and this is my fault for not having carefully as necessary read the letter from A&F with respect to tax issues and tax collection issues, and there's really 3 that come out of that letter that I think we need to discuss. One is the request that A&F made that we put a requirement on retailers that at POS they are able to separate and track marijuana products versus non-marijuana products, as they're subject to different taxation. So that's something I think we can put on the table. Second is the request that DOR have the ability to audit for tax compliance licensed retailers. And third is that DOR has, as they do I think currently, the right to seize assets for tax non-payment. Those are the 3 A&F suggestions that I think we need to discuss after our break. But I think we really need to start with the topic that we're on right now about this mandatory disqualification. So I'm going to suggest we take a 45-minute break. It's 12:15.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I'm sorry. Did I miss anything?
We do a little longer just to give.
I think we need. I think we need to. No,
Just to 1:30. That's.
Oh, the break, a longer break is what you're saying, or not break now?
Yeah, no, a longer break.
Oh, that's fine. I thought you were suggesting. I'm fine. Let's,
No, I'm sorry.
I think 1:30 is fine. So we'll break till 1:30, but I do think it's important that we take a break now.
Oh,
so,
yeah, no, that's fine.
okay. I'm sorry.
No,
I
that's
misunderstood. So if there are no objections, we'll reconvene at 1:30. Thank you. Convened. I want to say, for whatever it's worth, that it took every ounce of willpower in my entire body, and even then I only barely was able to avoid getting in my car and finding the nearest golf course. It's beautiful outside, but for better or worse, I resisted. I wanted to just make a couple of comments and then we'll get back into it. I know that the meeting today has been a little bit disjointed. I apologize for that. We had a structure and we're trying to follow that structure, but just given the number of issues and the time frame, a couple of things did come up last night or early this morning, and it was impossible to kind of jam them into the structure that we'd used. So my apologies if it seems a little disjointed. The materials that we'll post on our website at the end of the meeting today, hopefully we'll put the structure back in for some things that we added at the last minute. So my apologies for that. I went through before we took a lunch break the topics that we had to cover, but obviously the first topic that I want to get back into is the topic that we were discussing when we adjourned, and that's about automatic disqualification. I want to say, this is an important topic, obviously, and it's one that people feel strongly about. I respect the fact that all of my fellow commissioners are doing their absolute best to try to figure this out, navigate this, and get it right. And so the one thing I just want to encourage all of us to remember is that we all have the same objectives here. Even if there's some disagreements, we all are trying to do the right thing. And certainly I respect that each and every one of my fellow commissioners. I thought I would start by asking if anybody wanted to make a comment before we started the conversation, because I would like to make a comment, but I didn't want to be the only one to do so. So I'm going to just ask each of my commissioners, and feel obviously no obligation to do so, but if anybody wants to make a comment based upon the conversation we've had thus far, before we start the discussion again, let me give everybody a chance to do so, starting with Commissioner Doyle.
I'm just going to thank everybody for their continued hard work.
Commissioner Tyler? Yeah. Commissioner Flanagan? Commissioner McBride?
Are we going to jump back into?
Yeah.
Sure. Then my comment there is going to be, it is my hope that as we're structuring this industry that we are doing everything that we can to make sure that we are adopting sensible, reasonable regulations and striking a good balance. Now, we can't avoid the fact that since we drafted these regulations in December, the enforcement landscape has shifted. And we are dealing in a world where we no longer have the relative safety of the Cole Memorandum. We are dealing in a world where unwanted federal attention could lead to undermining the industry that we're working really hard to establish. And I understand and realize that this is, I get it. I understand the sensitivity of this topic. About a month ago today, we have a U.S. attorney who made a statement that his focus was going to be on trafficking of drugs like heroin and fentanyl. I think it's common sense to understand that the engagement of individuals with convictions for dangerous drug crimes could potentially bring the exact unwanted attention that I think we're trying hard to avoid in structuring this industry soundly. So I can understand that this topic is one that people would just as soon avoid, but I think that it's one that we need to have a conversation about, and I think that it goes to the stability of the industry that we're trying to establish, and the potential liabilities that could attend this. So,
Thank you, Commissioner McBride. I'd like to just say a few things, and again, probably don't need to say that I'm speaking personally now. First of all, I pretty much respect and agree with everything that Commissioner McBride just said. I'm particularly happy that she used the word balance, because I do think pretty much in everything, not just on this topic. I think the biggest challenge has been balance between various parts of the legislation that we're trying to administer. Balance between public health and public safety, balance between equity, balance between big and small players. I think you can all understand from the conversations we've had over the last 2.5 days, we've tried to find that balance on a number of issues, not just this one. So this is just, to me, another balancing act. There is also no roadmap. I agree with Commissioner McBride that the landscape has changed a little bit in the last month. But I just wanted to kind of offer my personal opinion on this subject, which is that we are talking about agents. I feel very differently talking about licensees for establishments. We're talking about employees. The technical term is marijuana establishment agents, but we're talking about employees. We're talking about people that have paid their debt to society. We are talking about people that would be hired if employees think that they have the skills and the character to do the job. And we are talking about people that might not be able to get any other job. I have no personal experience. I'm not apologizing for this. I'm not embarrassed about this, but I've had a pretty privileged life. And I don't know, therefore, kind of firsthand the experience of people that have been incarcerated in the past for these offenses. But I do know that the ones I've spoken to a lot over the last 6 months, are just trying to get their life back. They have paid a gigantic price for the mistakes they've made in the past, and they're trying to get their life back. And I view one of the great parts of the legislation that we're trying to enact or enable, and frankly the role that we've all agreed to play, is to actually play a positive role in helping in that respect. And so for the agents that we're talking about, that have paid their debt to society, that need a job, need help getting their life back, and are going to be subject, as I said, to the normal constraints of getting a job, of proving to an employer that they can do the job. I actually think it's not just a good thing to do. I think it's an imperative thing to do to allow them to participate in this industry. I will make it very clear that, in my opinion, we're talking about past offenses and offenses for which people have paid their debt to society. The nanosecond any agent would, in the future, violate any of these laws, they would have to lose their license or their ability to participate in this industry instantaneously. But if we're talking about the past and debts paid to society, I very strongly support their ability to participate in this industry. Commissioner Tyler?
So we're done with statements then?
I think so.
Great.
Nobody else wanted to, so go. Yeah.
Okay, so I did have a chance to think about this, and I think we are in agreement that certainly there are people who whose past conduct should not allow them to be a registered agent. As you said, drugs that kill people, I can think of certainly offenses in the past where none of us would want that person to be working as a registered agent. We did just go through the whole process of describing how important it is for a commission to have discretion, and that is the way that I lean. I have a pretty deep concern about taking away our discretion with a mandatory blanket exclusion on a population, particularly when we do have a statutory mandate to promote the inclusion of communities disproportionately harmed by, and then we are using that exact same drug law to then make a mandatory bright line exclusion of people. I think that warrants a very careful conversation we should have. I would start with saying, why don't we go through the process of a person who is not what we would all think of as the average person with a trafficking conviction, because whatever our personal image of that might be, because we're talking about a blanket exclusion, right? So let's talk about a scenario in which someone has gone through, has been incarcerated, for example, has paid their debts to society, has been rehabilitated, and now is trying to go through the process. So the first hurdle they would have to go through is to be hired by one of our licensees. So that in itself is a level of rehabilitation you would have to show to get a job in a very competitive industry. Then secondly, they would go through the mandatory background check. Third, we would have the discretion, as we just passed, to look at their application to be an agent and consider the factors that we just gave ourselves in which their conduct may affect their ability to be a registered agent. So we would already, under that process, be able to exclude someone who has, for example, committed a trafficking conviction that makes them unsuitable to be an agent. So my question, therefore, is, considering there are all different kinds of jobs that our licensees may be offering, some of them may not even touch a marijuana plant, some of them might be in marketing. People of all different backgrounds, situations. What does that process not address? What gaps are there such that we then need to make a mandatory blanket exclusion that they are not allowed to even look for work?
So the point, I understand the point is well taken. Again, my concern is that while this applies to individuals, we as a regulatory agency tasked with regulating the industry, have to look at it broadly. And I have concerns that the mere fact of this being a potential opening for individuals who we're not just talking about a conviction that's for a simple possession or a distribution. It's ratcheted up. It's quantities that are ascertainable and significant in many, many cases. And that we need to be looking at this in a very broad way. And it's for that reason that I'm suggesting the approach that I have put on the table. The gaps that are created are going to be where we are going to be, I think it's foreseeable, getting the most negative actions that are going to reflect on our agency and the entire industry. And so my approach here is to try to narrow those gaps as much as we can, and try to put forth a structure where we are saying that we do have a bright line about what we can pallet and what we can't.
I heard two things there. I want to make sure I'm understanding them. So 2 questions. First, are you concerned that we would have so many people going through this process that have trafficking convictions that we would not have the resources to look at them individually and make a judgment?
I don't know. I don't know that any of us know. But I am concerned enough about the uncertainty of the federal landscape to be really concerned about what unwraps in the next year and 2 years, and as long as we are kind of under this particular federal administration. So I am concerned enough about that, and I'm concerned enough about that I would really like to, I'm doing what I can as an individual commissioner to put forth a recommendation in an effort to try to take away as much of that risk as possible. And it's no surprise to anybody on this commission or in this room who's been paying attention for the past months. I'm risk averse. I am. And it's not a reflection, this recommendation is not a reflection on rehabilitation and I understand that it is all wrapped up together and that people are going to criticize me for making this recommendation with claiming that it's a proxy for something, and it is not. This for me is about a great concern about the attention that we are going to be drawing and are drawing, and I would not be doing my job as a caretaker for this commission and someone who's been asked to establish this industry and try to strike a balance if I didn't raise this and ask the commission to consider it.
Can I ask my
I'm
second
concerned.
question?
Yeah, please, I just want to make sure it's not just two-person conversation. Go ahead, ask your second question.
Yeah, I'll just ask one more question. then
Yeah,
I'll-
thanks.
Okay, so the second question is, I don't think this is a proxy for anything. I think it's a genuine conversation about people going through the process and what may happen after that. And that is why I'm so concerned about it. My question, and this is a genuine question, is your concern the consequences of people getting through this process if we don't have a mandatory exclusion and what might happen? Or is your concern a matter of perception if we don't pass a blanket exclusion, or both?
So I think for better or for worse, it's both. But the second one, the perception that we are taking risks that put us into a category of drawing attention that I don't want to draw is really concerning to me. I don't want, for the work that we have done here, all of the hours and the years in some cases, and many, many months and hours of really hard work to get to this point where we are today, to be undermined by assertions that we are not responsible, and that we are not serious, and that we are not doing our job as regulators. And that is a very big point of emphasis for me, that as regulators, we are tasked with the care of building this industry, and this is something where it raises the specter of unwanted interventions for me.
Can I ask Commissioner Flanagan or Commissioner Doyle? In terms of the number, I have something I'd like to say, but I want this to be a commission conversation as much as possible. So Commissioner Doyle or Commissioner Flanagan?
Go ahead, you go first.
Commissioner Doyle.
I appreciate the work that Commissioner McBride has done on this and her thoughtful approach to it. I'm also very appreciative of the points that you have made regarding the potential for sweeping people who have been rehabilitated into this category by using a mandatory disqualification. I think the thing that tips me in favor of it, in favor of the mandatory disqualification, is simply where we are at in terms of the stage of the industry that we're at. So, as noted by Commissioner McBride, we do have a sort of uncertain federal environment right now. Quite frankly, it wasn't that certain even prior to the withdrawal of the Cole Memorandum. I think this issue would bear re-examination if that federal issue changed status in the coming years and as the industry matures and it stabilizes. But we are talking about the very start of the industry, and I think it would contribute to the stability and the perception of stability and frighten people less. And let's be honest, it does somewhat frighten people. I think the reactions that we've gotten in public comment, if we included this, at least for now, with a pledge to continue to re-examine all suitability issues on an ongoing basis as we learn more and as the industry grows. So that's where I'm at personally.
Thank you, Commissioner Doyle. Commissioner Flanagan?
So, I think for me, and I say that, to me, trafficking is a non-starter. It's a non-starter for a lot of things. We all come from different backgrounds, and I've seen the devastation that drugs in general can do to the population here in Massachusetts. I can't tell you the families that I've met with, the people that I've put in detox, the things that I've seen, whether it be in prison or in our local jail or in hospitals and rehabs and what have you, that I think as a regulator, it's important for me to roll out regulations that are going to strengthen this industry in Massachusetts. And I think that you know, we're living in a time where we're at a crossroads, sort of. We have people that have been very active in their activism and trying to fight the prohibition of marijuana or cannabis, whatever you want to call it. And we talk about how people have been disproportionately affected in our communities, and we talk about how we need to provide this economic boon to our communities to try to move them out from where they've been. We've identified 29 cities and towns that have more than others, I guess you can say, for lack of a better phrase, been affected by this. But at the same time, I truly think we need to start to move past that and acknowledge the fact that it is here. The voters have voted. The legislature has passed their legislation. And that it's time for us to move to regulate this. It's time for us to work as partners and as in compromising. And it's really disheartening, and I don't blame anybody for the comments that have been made, whatever media or place or whatever they've been made, is that they're fearful. Like even yesterday we talked about how, a police chief signing off versus a police chief approving. People are fearful that it's just going to be turned down automatically. I can tell you that as someone who has been doing public appearances across the state, there's just a lot of questions. Cities and towns have questions. They have not been engaged in this for as long as everybody else has, and they want to know what it's going to be like for their Main Street. And I can't help but think that we need to work with them to get them to a place where it's here. And this is what we're going to now roll out as regulators. I'm the only person in the state that has voted no on the question, yes on the law, and is now regulating the law. And so those are very different hats that I've had to wear. None of which was allowed to be done personally. It was all done in a public setting. So everything I've ever said or done has been reported on. Having said that, I think when you have 50 pounds of fentanyl or cocaine or methamphetamines or whatever controlled substances you're talking about, that is a much different charge or conviction than possession. And I understand that we want to allow people to get into this industry. We want people to have jobs. The places that I've toured have a multitude of jobs. I mean, we have people from culinary schools who are heading up the edibles departments in certain places. We have people that come from different college backgrounds. We have people who don't have college degrees that are working and they're getting jobs. And I think that on the onset of this, I'm more comfortable in erring on the side of caution in order to strengthen this than to say that we are going to prevent the suitability disqualification, because I do think that there's a line. I do think that there's a limit, and at some point we have to, whether it's popular or it's unpopular, or we're criticized or we're chastised, we need to have this conversation, and it's not going to be comfortable. It never is. And I think when it comes down to it for me, we want inclusion in this, but we can't always forget everything that happened in the past when it comes to that level. There's a lot of things that we can tolerate. There's a lot of things that are okay, but for me, trafficking is not one of them. I come from a blue-collar union family where my grandfather and my father and my great-grandfather worked to help build some places in this state. There were no college degrees involved. I know how difficult it is to feed families and to raise families depending on where you live in Massachusetts. But I think the reality for me is that we are in the midst of a drug epidemic. And quite frankly, some of the conversations that I've had with people surrounding the cannabis industry, there's a denial that you can be in some ways addicted to this, while the DSM clearly states that some people are addicted and they have that gene and they're addicted to many things. So we can't excuse one thing on one end and then just allow something else on the other end. And to me, I'm in favor of this because I really think that people are looking to Massachusetts as a model. They often do when Massachusetts rolls out a new industry or does something that's this big. And I want to make sure that I can go to sleep at night knowing that we're doing the right thing. And I appreciate the work that has been done by Commissioner Title and Commissioner McBride and Commissioner Doyle and Commissioner Hoffman. This has been a very transparent process, and that's why I think it's so difficult. We're not allowed to have these conversations without everyone listening and judging and making judgments or reporting on it, and that's what makes this such an important conversation.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Flanagan. This has a certain air of inevitability to it, but I'd like to just jump in with a couple of comments if I could. First, I certainly respect Commissioner McBride, both in terms of her concern on the actions or potential actions at the federal level and her risk aversion. I think that's great. I think that's actually an admirable quality among many admirable qualities. I probably don't share that risk aversion. But I also will say that, I thought long and hard before I took this job, not only because I was giving up my retirement, but because I thought this was going to be a really hard job. Little did I understand. But when I was thinking about whether I was going to take this job or not, one of the things I thought about is I was going to do what I thought was right. And I was not going to worry about what the press was going to say, and I was not going to worry about what advocates were going to say, or industry associations were going to say, or elected or appointed officials. I was going to do the right thing, and I tried to prepare myself for being criticized by any or all of those groups. And I still stand by that. So while I am very concerned, and I share Commissioner McBride's concern about federal intervention and undoing all the work that we are doing and all the good we're trying to do over the last 6 months, I don't care what anybody is going to say other than the five of us saying to each other, which we do all the time, we're trying to do the right thing here. So I am very concerned about what might happen at the federal level, but I want to do what I think is right, regardless of what that means at the federal level, because frankly, if nothing else, it's pure speculation. Nobody knows what's going to happen. So I respect the argument of Commissioner McBride. I'm not swayed by it in terms of my own thinking. I want to do what I think is right, and what I think is right is what I've already articulated. The second thing is, I want to make it clear, because it seems like there might be less translation. I am vehemently opposed to and abhor trafficking of addictive, dangerous, deadly drugs. I abhor it. I believe in our system of laws, however, and people that have been convicted have been imprisoned and paid their debt to society. I believe that it's not the job of the commission to say whether that debt was adequate or not, whether the conviction was long enough or short enough or harsh enough. They have paid their price. They have been released from prison. They are now members of our communities, and I don't think that we need to say they weren't punished harshly enough. That's not our job. So I respect our system of laws. I respect the fact that people have paid their debt to society, and I want to help them rebuild their lives. So I don't want anybody to hear that I don't think trafficking is a horrible offense. I do. But I think that people have paid their debt to society, and it's not our job to impose additional punishment. So, that being said, I'm not sure that we shouldn't just put this to vote. I'm happy to go ahead, Commissioner Title.
I have two suggested amendments. First, we talked about fentanyl and opiates a lot. However, the motion on the table is for all narcotics.
Minus marijuana, minus solely marijuana.
Minus marijuana.
Crimes, yes.
So, and it's been a while since I've done criminal law, but I think that's a pretty long list. My suggestion would be that we write certain drugs and then ask the public safety subcommittee, which includes law enforcement who work with this issue every day, to come back with what drugs they would include on that list.
You said you had multiple suggestions?
And my second suggestion would be that we consider making this apply to jobs that include access to the plant itself, because not all jobs do.
I think that is a fair recommendation. Can you tell me more about where we would
Which
be
one are you
drawing
responding to,
that
Commissioner
line?
McBride, the second one?
The second one.
So I envision that when the agent registration form is submitted and the background check is done, if the person has a trafficking conviction, there would be an exception to the mandatory exclusion if the job does not involve touching the marijuana plant or access to the marijuana plant.
I'm willing to accept that as a recommendation. On the first one, I can go through the list of what is included in 32E, Chapter 94C, Section 32E, if that is helpful to illuminating, and I can talk a little bit about what we're.
I don't feel confident to know which drugs. I just don't feel confident to. So if we want to exclude, or at least consider excluding, I prefer to go with some variation, perhaps, of Commissioner Title's suggestion that experts help us, because I feel like I'm completely inexpert on this topic, and I couldn't possibly make an informed vote about which to include and which to exclude.
I'm not comfortable with putting this to the subcommittee for.
I appreciate that.
I'm not. I think we are on the last day of getting these regulations underway. We are going to be drafting them, finalizing them, voting on them next week. I am willing to take, and I think it's a good recommendation from Commissioner Title on the agents who would not be touching cannabis, but on the first recommendation, that's I'm not sort of willing to unwrap that at this point. At a future date, if, as Commissioner Doyle pointed out, this, and as I hope we pointed out, and we'll point out again, that these regulations need to be evolving and they need to be something that we come back to over and over again. And I don't mean to give Commissioner Doyle hives with that, because I know that we, kind of talk about opening the regulations, and it's not the simplest, easiest process to do that. But on matters of great importance, and I include this in that category, then we should take into consideration what the results of our actions are. And if it is that we begin licensing and begin opening establishments, and there is reliable information that there is a wide exclusion, then we should be coming back and revisiting that. But today, sort of where my recommendation is in terms of the content, notwithstanding the amendment by Commissioner Title, is kind of where my recommendation is.
Could I clarify?
Please.
So I wasn't suggesting that we ask the Advisory Board Public Safety Subcommittee to come back to us by the time these regulations are finalized. I was suggesting that, as we have done with many issues, that we would define certain narcotic trafficking convictions for the purposes of this exclusion, and then by the time agent registration starts, we would then have a list.
And so, I don't know if we're going to be able to reach what types. What are the types of exclusions that we would be?
Oh, I was talking about specific narcotics. Right.
So talk to me about about that valuation and what we're including in there.
Right. Well, it seems clear to me that much of this decision making, correct me if I'm wrong, rests on perception and the expressions of people being frightened. And so, based on those factors, I do think the specific drug, the specific narcotic in question, is a factor that would affect the perception and people being frightened. That's why I think the list could be limited.
So I'm sorry to be painful about this. How are we limiting it? If we have to draft this into a regulation for next week, how are we limiting it and I see a volunteer.
So we would add the word certain before narcotics,
And then make that.
as defined by the commission.
And then make that available how? As like,
So that would be available with the guidance that comes with the agent registration form, and it would say if you have these certain narcotic convictions, there's a mandatory exclusion. Does that seem unworkable?
well, I'm trying to think through sort of due process, and the implications of it.
Can I
Go ahead,
interrupt for a
Commissioner
second?
Goy.
I just was trying to do probably not the most thorough legal research, but at least try to find where trafficking occurs is mentioned in 94C. And it does look like 94C, section 32E is where
Yeah.
trafficking is discussed. And it does seem like they identify, and it doesn't seem like it's a long list to me of drugs that we're talking about here. Marijuana obviously is accepted under our statute, but they do have a very specific list here of cocaine, heroin, morphine, opium, and then derivatives thereof, and then they also specifically identify fentanyl. There may be something else in here, but it's actually not that lengthy a list. Could we just refer to 94C 32E?
And meth,
Is meth in here? I'm sorry.
methamphetamine, yep.
Yeah.
Commissioner Town. Go ahead, speaking for.
If we would read that list one more time and then vote, that's fine.
So, is it okay if I do it? Okay. It looks like it's cocaine, heroin, morphine, opium, or derivatives thereof. Fentanyl, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find methamphetamine.
It is.
It's 32EB2.
While we're doing that, would it be okay if after the vote, I just took an opportunity to put it into plain English for people so they know what just passed?
Sure.
Would that be okay?
Paragraph for commission or for?
No, just for people with convictions that are wondering what happened.
Sure.
So I just can't find it. Can someone else read it?
So cocaine, methamphetamine, phenmetrazine,
I'm sorry, what was after amphetamines?
phenmetrazine, heroin, morphine, opium, fentanyl.
Okay.
That's it.
So I think that we should vote on the recommendation of Commissioner McBride, amended by Commissioner Title with respect to excluding from mandatory disqualification those agents who do not touch the product. But we are not going to amend the list. It's going to be the list excluding marijuana from the section of law that we were just citing. Is that the correct proposal?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure. I'm proposing that, I'm asking for a motion to approve the recommendation of Commissioner McBride to call for automatic disqualification based upon trafficking offenses with the exclusion of the amendment proposed by Commissioner Title to exclude from automatic disqualification those agents that do not touch the product, but to leave the list of drugs that qualify for automatic exclusion per the statute you just read, with the exclusion of marijuana.
I have a language clarification.
Sure.
It was employees who do not touch or have access.
Or touch or have access to the product. Thank you. So can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Doyle make a motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner McBride. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed?
Nay.
Nay. Let the record show that this was approved by the commission by a vote of 3-2, with Commissioners Doyle, McBride, and Flanagan voting in favor, and Commissioners Kyle and Hoffman voting opposed. Thank you.
Can I take that opportunity to summarize?
Sure, please do. Commissioner Kyle.
Okay, so just for people who may be watching who have a conviction that's wondering what changed for them. So if you have a marijuana conviction, nothing has changed due to the statute. If you have a 94C conviction, nothing has changed because of the statute. If you are applying for a job where you would touch or have access to cannabis, and you have a trafficking conviction for cocaine, methamphetamine, phenmetrazine, heroin, morphine, opium, or fentanyl, then you will not be able to get a job touching the plant now. But this does not apply to possession, distribution, or intent to distribution to distribute convictions. And then lastly, this only applies to marijuana companies that are licensed by the commission. So if it's something to do with marijuana, but you're not a dispensary or cultivation or manufacturing or something under the commission, this doesn't affect you.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate, by the way, I appreciate that conversation. Thank you all for the, I know this is a tough issue, and I appreciate the structure and the tone of that conversation, so thank you. We have, as I said, a few more issues, and I apologize that they're not necessarily in a logical sequence other than it's the sequence they are in my notes. So let's start with responsible vendor. Commissioner Doyle said there was language that had been omitted from our draft regulations. Could you articulate that, please?
I could, except I was expecting you to go
Okay.
tiering next, and I've given the slide to Mary Alice, so hang on one
Okay, no, Mary,
second.
I think Mary also.
No.
Okay,
No.
sorry.
You threw me for a loop there. Hang on 1 second while I recover from that.
Just trying to keep you on your toes.
Apparently. Is there any reason we can't do tiering next since I
No,
have
we are going to, now I'm going to get more criticism from our executive director about the unstructured nature of our conversation today. So, no, let's talk about tiering.
Thank you. Much appreciated for your flexibility. Now, Mary Alice, if you wouldn't mind queuing up that PowerPoint slide. Thank you. And while we're working on that, the backdrop to this is, as we all know, since we all discussed it the past couple of days, we had voted to do this 100,000 square foot cap for cultivation per licensee. And in looking at that, and then the conversation about controls on production, it occurred to me that as we are looking at, and previously in December voted to reevaluate that every 6 months, growth of only being able to move up 5,000 square feet every 6 months was somewhat constrained, perhaps. And so this is solely talking about production growth, although it will have a side effect, perhaps, on fees,
Which we'll talk about
later. Don't worry.
No, we'll talk about that right after we get done with this. So.
So I thought we should revisit how the tiers are structured. On the left-hand side, you see essentially what we already had with some additional tiers. And I'm sorry, Commissioners, I can email this to you if you want to look at it on your laptop. I apologize if you can't see it. Tier, you know, it's, very similar to what you already had, except tier 3 and 4 are bigger in option 1, and the entire option 2 is bigger because it's chopped up by 10,000 square feet increments rather than 5,000 square feet increments.
And just for clarification, the current tiering that are in the draft regulations, which are 4 tiers, the first tier is up to 1,000 square feet.
Yep.
The second tier is 1,001 to 5,000 square feet. The third tier is 5,001 to 10,000 square feet. So what Commissioner Doyle is proposing is reducing the number of tiers at the low end, as well as adding tiers at the higher end.
Right, and so what it does, just because I know we all have a bit of a small business lens, I want to reassure that there is still a licensing fee of 0.25 per square foot, regardless of the tier. This pertains to growth management. So essentially you would pick where you want to start out and then proceed a year after your licensure to have your ability to stay, move up, etc., based on these 10,000 square foot tiers. I think because we had started out this conversation of growth management, I think in a quarterly place, and we ended up moving to 6 months. So what I had failed to appreciate at that time was the constraint that went on that if you made the growth opportunity less frequent, you were, by failing to change the tiers, also having an impact that way. Essentially, you were constraining growth more than we, or at least I, who originally drafted the language, intended to. And the only difference I should clarify between option 1 and option 2 is in option 1 there are 11 tiers, and tier 1 and tier 2 are broken down in 5,000 square foot increments, and thereafter it's 10,000 square foot increments. Option 2, again, is all 10,000 square foot.
I have no problem with this. I think option 1, I prefer at the lowest end to have those 2 tiers.
Mm-hmm. It actually means more constraint on them, though.
I understand.
Okay.
Any other comments?
I prefer option 1.
Okay, so can I have a recommendation, or can I have a motion to approve option 1? And again, we'll talk about fees, I think separately, but immediately after we have this vote.
So moved.
Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Flanagan made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor of option 1?
Aye.
Aye.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's your proposal. Let the record show that the Commission unanimously approved this motion. Could you lead this up, please, Commissioner Doyle? Without going to the fee table, just referring to this because my fee table doesn't have these tiers, we had in December essentially approved a 25-cent per square foot licensing fee for these tiers. We'd also approved different application fees for the four tiers. We have to come back and talk about that, but for the actual annual license fees, it was essentially 25 cents per square foot. What we just voted on would not change that. It would still be 25 cents, although Commissioner Doyle did raise the possibility of, in the option we just approved, option 1, for tier 1 and tier 2, having it at 10 cents a square foot rather than 25 cents. Is that correct?
As much as I would like to claim ownership, we just got a couple comments that suggested that.
Okay.
So, and it's just, again, I think encouraging small business law and market barriers.
The only argument I can think of against that, I'm not saying I oppose it or favor it, but the only argument against it is that, again, annual license fees are intended to cover the cost of inspection and regulation, and they're driven to a larger extent, in my opinion, by a facility rather than the size of the facility. Because you have to send an inspector out there, they gotta take the time to go out there. There clearly is a little more work, more square footage that has to be inspected, but the primary driver of cost, in my opinion, is the number of facilities
which is why I would argue for keeping it as it is right now, which is 25 cents a square foot for each tier. Comments or thoughts? Okay. I don't think, since that's not a change to our current regulations, that was required. The other thing that does need to be considered, and Mary Alice, if you could go back to the main deck. Pardon? No, I think we're done. I think we're done with this. Or minimize it if you wouldn't mind, so that we can get to it if we need to. Thank you. So we've just talked about the annual license fees, and we agree that we're going to keep with our 25 cents per square foot. We did vote yesterday that for outdoor cultivation, those fees would be reduced by 50%, so that's not necessary to discuss anymore. The only thing that we need to talk about, since we just changed the tiering, is that there are right now different application fees for the 4 tiers. 100 for, these are the old tiers that we just obsoleted. But there are different application fees, 100, 200, 400, and 600 respectively for tiers 1 through 4 in our draft regulations. Now that we have 10 tiers, I think we need to agree on what we want to do with respect to application fees by tier.
Yeah, I think we have 11 tiers actually if we voted option 1.
Oh.
Yep.
Making my life even more difficult.
Sorry.
Thank you. That's your objective, I think.
Definitely.
I think what we can do, I'm not sure I can do this in my head quite yet, but I think I'm pretty sure I can, is just take, the 11 tiers that we just voted on and apply them to one of the 4 historical tiers and use the same application fee that we had historically, because you can match the 11 back to these 4.
I would be comfortable if the other commissioners are comfortable saying that we vote to authorize the chairman to use the same methodology that he used to get to those, and then propose that as part of the language adoption next week.
If everybody else is comfortable with that, I'm certainly comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Application fees, right?
Yeah, I think we've already covered annual fees.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know that you did.
Pardon?
I don't know that you formally adopted the outdoor piece.
I thought we did, my memory, I guess, is not as good as well. I thought we voted on that yesterday.
I think you held fees.
Okay,
We deferred
so
it.
then I think, let me just again cover all of this. So we have agreed to option 1, and that's 11 tiers. We have agreed and do not need to vote on the fact that we are keeping the annual license fees at 25 cents. We are going to employ the same methodology to come up with application fees per tier. We'll have that in our final language to be reviewed and approved next week. The other issue that our executive director said we need to discuss and vote on is that yesterday we discussed, and I think agreed on, but didn't formally vote on, that the annual license fees and the application fee would be reduced by 50% for outdoor cultivators. So I guess I would like to put that on the table and ask for a motion to approve, since we did discuss this yesterday, we just didn't formally approve it.
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Tyler made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that that was approved unanimously. Thank you very much. Are you ready for responsible vendors yet?
Mr. Chairman,
Oh,
sorry. Would
sure.
this be a good time to discuss the proposal for a fee for additional locations of the sticks for co-ops?
I guess we should do that. I guess we haven't formally voted on it. We did talk about it this morning, but yes, thank you very much for that clarification. So we had a discussion yesterday, but I promised to go do some work on it tonight, which I did, or last night, which I did. If we reduced or eliminated the cap on the number of facilities or members in a co-op above 6, which we agreed to do, then the question, and we agreed that we would figure out, or I would figure out, propose to the commission, what would be the incremental licensing cost for a co-op that had more than 6 members. And what I did is I took the annual license fee for the lowest tier, which was $1,000, and then again, it was based upon analysis that I had done. Bless you. That was based upon analysis I had done prior to our meetings in December. That was attempting to estimate our inspection and enforcement costs and the smallest facilities had 1,000, but my estimate of those that cost was $1,000 annually, so that was the logic for having a $1,000 annual license fee for Tier 1, old Tier 1. So my proposal would be that we would assess or set a license fee for co-ops that would be at a base based upon the total amount of square footage that that co-op would apply for, whatever that would be. And if they had anything in addition to 6 locations or 6 members, an additional $1,000 annual fee per member above 6. So that's my proposal. Go ahead, Commissioner Madden.
I think that's a very logical, intuitive way to approach it.
But
you saw that coming. Just as a matter of relativity or proportionality, if it's $1,000 for our costs as a licensing matter, then I would think if the co-op is already in place and it's an additional location, some of that work would be done already on our part, so I would think that incrementally it should be a little bit lower.
I guess what would be in part in your
So, okay,
thinking?
so what are the costs that the licensing fee covers?
Well, it covers a pro rata distribution of the staff, the licensing staff that we have across the commission, the other expenses that are incurred in licensing. So, for instance, automobiles, hazmat suits, training, all the so. In our fiscal 18 budget and our fiscal 19 budget, we estimated all of those costs. And so that's where those data come from. So I'm not sure, I'm open-minded to your suggestion. I'm just not sure which of those costs would not be incrementally incurred by adding essentially a new facility or new location, because most of those I think are location-based.
Yeah, so I could be wrong about this, but just bringing it up for discussion, thinking about the staff time to inspect and to inspect. I would think that if it was a co-op, perhaps you had done already part of the work in reviewing the paperwork, or even if it's even if it's like just a 10% reduction, that may make a big difference in cost.
Other thoughts? I think that's a reasonable suggestion. I don't know that I have off the top of my head even an estimate of what percentage of it is driven by a facility versus the kind of background preparation work that you just described. I think it intuitively makes sense. Or as you just said to me, I think it's a very logical way to think about it. But other comments?
I just question, does this warrant just further looking at, and again, it's a relatively tiny issue, so if we agree that in principle, I think we even already voted this, but I'll double check with Director Collins, that we are going to add charge fees for locations addition to 6, do further work just to examine what that fee should be and vote on the precise fee along with other language next week. Is that comfortable for everyone? Just in the interest of getting everything.
Just in the interest of, I'm comfortable doing that work. So if people are comfortable deferring the specific number with the understanding, it's not going to change dramatically, but it might be reduced somewhat based upon commissioner titles and thoughts. I'm happy if everybody on the commission is happy to do that work and to certainly circulate it ahead of time and finalize it next week. So does that require a vote, or?
I think we may have already voted that, but we were going to look at that as how we were doing that additional location issue.
For the craft cooperative?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Okay, any other issues with respect to license fees or application fees before we move on? I think I've covered at least everything I'm aware of. Thank you. I'm going to try for the third time. Can you talk about responsible vendors?
I can't believe we haven't talked about that yet. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we did actually discuss and approve this in December, but due to a drafting error, the actual details of it did not end up in the draft regulation. So I just want to refresh everybody's memory, because obviously December has been some time ago. What had been proposed and was largely recommended through at least one advisory board subcommittee was that marijuana establishments, agents were required to undergo responsible vendor training, and that all owners, managers, and employees that are involved in the handling and sale of marijuana for adult use are going to be required to complete at least 2 hours of this vendor training. Employees that were more administrative in nature and did not handle or sell marijuana were encouraged to take responsible vendor training, but not required to do so. They would be doing it voluntarily. After the completion of the responsible vendor training, they have to do it annually. The subcommittee had recommended every 2 years, but I realized in other places in the regulations we had actually voted to make it an annual requirement, so I'm just making it annual to be consistent. There is also a record-keeping requirement that goes with this for keeping the records of the training for 4 years and making them available to inspection by the commission and any other applicable licensing authority, such as a local licensing authority if the particular host community adopts local licensing. We, as the commission, will provide guidance on a curriculum in the regulations and the core curriculum. I will say this is based on something that Denver has been doing, so this isn't something that we invented. This was something that was taken from Denver. It involves a discussion of marijuana's effect on the human body, diversion, prevention, and prevention of sales to minors, acceptable forms of identification training, in other words, how to check IDs well, and then other key state laws and rules that affect owners, managers, and employees that include local and state licensing and enforcement, incident and notification requirements, administrative and criminal liability, license sanctions and court sanctions, waste disposal, health and safety standards, patrons prohibited from bringing marijuana onto licensed premises, permitted hours of sale, conduct of establishment, permitting inspections by state and local licensing and enforcement authorities, licensee responsible for activities occurring within licensed premises, maintenance of records, privacy issues, prohibited purchases and practices, and then if there's any other training that we determine that we want to add to that sort of core curriculum. Particularly in the future, if there are other types of licenses that are added into the mix, if there's something that's specifically tailored to them. I think that is largely it, and I think the other thing that I may not have mentioned so far, as we originally discussed it, the training is provided by third parties. It's not provided by the commission itself. This is, again, sort of another economic stimulus thing where these people are not necessarily going to be in the marijuana business themselves, but they will benefit from the marijuana industry coming to the Commonwealth by getting this opportunity. They also are required to maintain training records available for inspection. They must maintain the written documentation of attendance by a particular person and that they passed a test based on the knowledge involved in the training. And there are options to do this training online. So if you live in a remote part of Massachusetts where the program isn't, that you would be able to complete it. I will put the caveat in here that I am going to ask that we may need to revisit that online issue if it becomes a problem in people being able to do it successfully online. There are requirements that attendees who can speak and write English be able to pass a written test with a score of 70% or better, and attendees who cannot speak or write English may be offered a verbal test, provided that the same questions are given that are on the written test, and the results of the verbal test are documented with a passing score of 70% or better. And then the programs are required to solicit effectiveness evaluations from the individuals who have completed their programs.
So my understanding, we discussed this and voted on this from a policy standpoint, that there's not.
Yeah, I'm just trying to refresh everyone's memory.
But isn't it therefore appropriate that we actually vote on this next week as part of the final regulations? Do we
Yes,
subsequent vote today?
We don't need a vote. I'm just trying to remind, everybody what it is, so that next week, everybody doesn't go, oh, what's that?
Okay. Go ahead, Commissioner Tyler.
I remember in that discussion having two suggestions that I'm not sure if they made it in or not.
This may be my old draft. Can you remind me what they were?
Yes, one was that, the responsible vendor training, that was done by third parties, those third parties would be accredited by the commission. Is that your understanding as well?
Oh, yeah, that is actually sounding familiar. That's a good idea. We have to work on language, but.
I can work on that with you. We might have done it already. The second thing is in terms of the record keeping. I suggested that just having kind of like worked in these areas and knowing how you like consider different requirements, if we were to make this into a proactive requirement after the training is done, it's signed by both the employer, employee, and then sent to us rather than kept on the site for inspection, I think that would be a useful requirement.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna hope that we have the record keeping capacity for that. So if we don't, we can obviously revisit that issue. It's just, is there any other record, and I apologize for asking, is there any other record that we're asking them to send us about individual employees, or are we inspecting on site?
I think that's the only one. I mean, other than the initial registration form.
Okay. Well, we can put it in for now, and then if we decide that it's overwhelming us administratively, then we can take it out again. Okay.
Storage is cheap.
Pardon?
Storage is cheap.
Yeah, I don't imagine there's a problem.
Commissioner Brand? Okay, so no vote necessary. We'll just review that and vote on it as part of our discussion next week on final regulations. Thank you, Commissioner Doyle. There's one set of topics left, which I referred to.
I'm so sorry. I did forget to say one thing that I think is actually policy driven. I do apologize.
I'm working. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the one thing that I would say about this is I'm wondering if this needs to be delayed a little bit to give people time to get up and running, because we're talking about third-party institutions here who need to form business plans, etc. So I don't think we can reasonably require current applicants, like the applicants coming right in, to comply with this, because their schools may not be ready.
Do you have any recommendation?
I was thinking July 1, 2019 being the potential effective date, that, you know, and if we need to push it back, we push it back. That way, that gives the time for the schools to get up and running.
Yeah, I agree with the idea of deferring. That seems like it's longer than necessary.
We need to accredit them as well.
I understand, but you know, I like putting short-term timeframes on and giving people pressure, because I think this section. The only reason we're doing this, obviously, is because I think it's really important. And I just think waiting a year is too long.
They also are required, in addition under our regulations, to do other training. This is a specific kind of
No, I understand.
training. So.
But we still think it's important enough to put it into the regulations.
I'm going to stick by my date.
Okay. Commissioner Tyler?
I was just wondering if Sean wanted to weigh in on that.
Carefully, I would say.
Yeah, I would
think
say.
July 1st, 2019 is reasonable.
I guess that is a policy that we need to discuss. Don't smile just because you won.
I would have declared victory.
Can I, any other comments or questions? So again, we don't need to discuss or vote on the actual proposal, since we did that previously. We'll vote on the language next week. So the only thing I think that we need to vote on, therefore, is deferring the implementation of this requirement until July 1st, 2019. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve. Commissioner Tyler seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, let the record show that that was unanimously approved by the Commission. Just so it's clear from an agenda standpoint, we're now on topics that I was not aware of when I put this agenda together. So the only set of topics that I am aware of that we have not yet covered, and I mentioned them again before lunch, are requests that came from the Department of Revenue through the letter we received from General Counsel of J&F. And a lot of that letter was recommendations with respect to public safety and social consumption and other issues that we've already discussed. But there were some 4 very specific requests from A&R that I just wanted to get on the table and have us discuss and vote on if necessary. One is that a marijuana retailer in all likelihood will sell products that are taxed under our law that we are regulating, as well as non-marijuana products, whether we call them paraphernalia or whatever, that are not subject to the 20% tax. And the request of DOR was to require marijuana retailers at POS to be able to track separately product sales that were subject to the tax under our legislation versus products that were just under normal sales tax. I'd actually like to ask the executive director his thoughts on that, since I know he's working on the seed sale tracking, which is going to be part of this.
As far as the capabilities of
Yep.
the marijuana retailer, from the actual software itself, the seed sale tracking, it can serve a point of sale function, but predominantly each retailer will maintain their own point of sale
Correct.
software that will integrate into our system. So,
Right.
and other jurisdictions do have this distinction.
Right.
Various tax rates for different products. So
And it's you know, my experience in the private sector with POS, it's a pretty simple thing to do.
That's correct.
So I guess I would put on the table for someone to make a motion to approve requiring that retailers through their POS system can separately track products subject to the taxes in our law versus other products.
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show that Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner McBride. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that was approved unanimously. Thank you. Second issue is the ability of the Department of Revenue to seize assets for tax non-payment. And I guess this is where my non-lawyer training is either a good thing or a bad thing. I always thought they had that authority.
Yeah, I would agree.
So if general counsel agrees, unless there's any objection, I just think we don't take any action on this.
I would just say that I actually followed up with DOR to just sort of
Get some color.
say exactly what you just said. And they did request that it just be added to our regulations in support and to bolster the authority they already have. And then also to put people who are regulated on notice that that is a possibility. I think most people are aware of that, but I don't think it ever hurts to be more informative.
Other thoughts? I guess it doesn't change anything, so it's redundant, but I guess if it was a request, I have no problem with that. So I guess I'd like a motion that we add that language consistent with the Department of Revenue's current authority.
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All in favor? I'm sorry, let the record show that Commissioner Planning made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Doyle. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that the Commission unanimously approved that. Thank you. The second is, the third is similar, which is the rights of the Department of Revenue to audit the books of marijuana establishments, which again, I believe is, so I presume it's the same thing.
You are correct, sir.
Thank you. So let's not even, can I have a motion to approve adding consistent language with respect to DOR's ability to audit the books of marijuana establishments?
So moved.
Second.
Let the record show Commissioner Doyle made the motion to approve, seconded by Commissioner Flanagan. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that Commission unanimously approved. The fourth thing is that there was some language, technical language on tax maps that were requested, so I'm going to ask that we defer that to next week when we're talking about technical language. I don't have the language in front of me. I don't know if you have clear language.
There is a lot of little technical things, some of which are actually beneficial to applicants, such as giving certain kind of licensees who, by the form of their business structure, already get a tax compliance form as part of their business. They would be able to provide that instead of a certificate of good standing that we were requesting. The other was that the one that is as close to substantive, I think, in my opinion, is the requirement that we originally had required people to show that they had actually filed their tax returns. The Department of Revenue asked that we add language saying and paid any tax due. So I think that's a reasonable request. And
That's in the application process?
I'm trying to remember.
I think that it is.
It was, it's 103. Yeah, it's, I think possibly the renewal rather than the application. It's the renewal. And I pushed back on that as well, just to find out if other people have to do that, not just marijuana people. And in fact, this is required in other professions, trades, or businesses pursuant to a certain statute. And in fact, some other businesses are required to show it up front.
So I think the proposal would be that we add to our renewal requirements that there is certification that taxes have been paid, taxes due have been paid. Is there any objection to that?
No objection, but what sort of documentation are they looking for?
Oh, you've gone beyond my level of knowledge, I'm afraid. I think that's probably something that we would have to clarify as we're building out the application process. But I'm sure there's got to be some form or something.
We can get that clarification for next week.
Yeah,
Well,
it seems to be something that's common.
Yeah, Commissioner McBride?
I have a question about how this is different than a certificate of good standing that we are already requiring
Right.
on renewal. So I'm confused as to if you're not in good standing, if you haven't paid or not.
I think this is a wonderful question for the General Counsel of DOR. I'm unable to answer that question. They did specifically request that it be added, so my thought is, and they went out of their way to give me information about other industries that this is required for, so apparently it is slightly different than what we had put in our draft regulations, but I can't give you much in the way of detail as to what.
Okay. I would like to follow up on that in the next few days, so why don't we put it in, and if it's something that we need to reopen next week and take out of the draft, then so be it.
I think it's a good
But I
suggestion.
think it's in the spirit of trying to reduce the burden. So.
I thank you, I agree with that. So I think we do need to take a vote, and then we will review this and determine what the language looks like in our conversations and votes next week. So
I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable taking a vote without the details of it.
What can we defer this, put it as the second of that one other thing? We had the particular dollar amount, and then we would have.
But they're separate issues. One is just analysis that uses the exact same methodology of analysis that we've already approved. And this, I don't think,
Right,
falls in that same category.
People aren't comfortable voting one way or the
Right.
other. I think it's worth it where it's just one additional issue to wait until next
Can
week.
I ask the General Counsel for opinion on this?
Well, I think it's up to the commission as to whether it wants to take a vote now or defer it to next week. I'm thinking about some language along the lines of basically, all marijuana establishments are subject to the laws governing taxation in the Commonwealth, and then putting in some specific language, but as the chair noted, this is really under their regulatory authority, not ours, so I wouldn't make it too complicated.
Okay.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, what I was waiting for information on was precisely when we asked for proof that they have paid their taxes, what that would require. That's the only thing I have questions on.
Okay, I apologize. I think as Commissioner McBride suggested, either I or a commissioner can reach out to the General Counsel and ask about the scope of that certification to see if it covers, but that's not information I have right now.
Okay.
So why don't we let's just delay it until.
That's fine.
That's totally
That's
fine.
fine. So let me ask the question, are there any other issues that we have not discussed with respect to policies that need to be decided to inform and get embedded in our final regulations? Sure, let's take I have about 10 to 3, we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock. Thank you. That we had set out to cover. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for both their stamina, but also just the way these conversations went in terms of the thoughtfulness that everybody put behind these issues, the mutual respect shown, and I'll just repeat what I said earlier, which is, the governor and the attorney general and the treasurer, based upon the law, put together a diverse commission with different backgrounds and different experiences, and therefore we come at things with different points of view, and I think that you saw that today. I think it's a healthy process, even if it's sometimes messy. But the one thing that is true is I never doubt where any of my fellow commissioners are coming from. We're all trying to do the right thing, and I just wanted to thank everybody for the way they participated and for what we did and what we accomplished over the last 3 days. That being said, just to remind everybody, the process is that
We are now going to go away and driven primarily by our general counsel, but I'm sure with input from commissioners, we are going to take our draft regulations and modify them based upon the decisions we've made over the last 3 days, circulate a draft of final regulations, and come back on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week and review and vote on those final regulations. Once we're done with that, if I'm correct, Commissioner Rowe will then submit that to the Secretary of State on the 9th of March, and then it will be promulgated on the 15th of March. So.
It's not promulgated on it's promulgated on the 9th, sorry.
Okay, yeah, no,
Really
this,
boring.
that's why I asked you
Yeah.
for help on this.
It's really boring technical language. Christine, feel free to jump in here anytime.
See, I thought I was proud of myself of knowing the word promulgation.
I am very impressed, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Promulgation, very nice point. So promulgated, my understanding is that is for the purpose that is when we approve it, but it won't be effective until it's published in the Secretary of State. The publishing deadline to get it published is March 9th, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
That sounds right.
So that being said, therefore, our next meeting will be this coming Tuesday, March 6th. We will be back at the Gaming Commission offices, and as I said, the primary sole topic will be to review and vote on drafts of our final regulations. So thank you all. We are adjourned as of 3:15 p.m. Thank you.